Man, I still can't shake it. It's been weeks, maybe months now. Time kind of blurs together after something like that messes with your head. I'm not even sure why I'm writing this down. Probably just to get it out, you know? Maybe someone else has gone through something similar because honestly, talking to people in real life about it, they just look at you like you're nuts. It was supposed to be a trophy buck hunt. Coshocton County, middle of nowhere. That's what I was looking for. Peace and quiet and a big deer, maybe bigger than any I'd gotten before. I'd spent weeks planning it, scouting maps, checking weather, prepping gear. I packed everything but the kitchen sink. Just wanted to be self-sufficient, you know, real wilderness experience. Found this spot near Wills Creek, off the beaten path, way off. Took me a good hour on these rutted dirt roads just to get there. Beautiful though, real quiet, except for the creek gurgling, trees all around, the kind of place that makes you feel like you're the only person on earth. Set up camp right by the creek, little clearing perfect for my tent, fire pit area, everything. First night was perfect, seriously. Sat by the fire, cooked up some steak and potatoes, drank a beer, just watched the stars come out. You can see so many more stars out there, no city lights to mess it up. Heard some deer moving around in the woods, sounded like they were fighting on the other side of the creek. Antler clashing sounds, that deep grunt they make. Got my blood pumping, thinking about opening day. Crawled into my tent around 10, heater humming away, sleeping bag warm as toast. Fell asleep pretty quick, excited for the hunt to start the next morning. Then it happened. Woke up freezing, like teeth chattering, body shaking cold. At first I was disoriented. Thought maybe I'd kicked off my sleeping bag. But no, still zipped in tight. Then I realized the heater was off, completely silent. That little propane heater was supposed to run all night on low. I fumble around in the dark for my flashlight, finally find it and flick it on. The tent is cold, like ice cold. Check the heater. Nothing. Dead as a doornail. Propane tank felt almost empty. Weird. It was supposed to be practically full. Didn't really matter why. I just needed to get it lit again. I'm fumbling around in the dark, getting a new propane canister, screwing it in, hoping it'll just spark back to life. That's when I heard it. The scream. It wasn't like anything I've ever heard before. Not an animal, not a human. It started high-pitched, almost like a woman screaming, but way deeper, rawer, and it went on and on and on. Like someone was in absolute agony, like something was being tortured to death. And then, the worst part, it changed. That high-pitched scream just dropped, turned into this deep, guttural growl, snarl. It was like a mix of both, and it echoed through the valley. It was so loud it vibrated in my chest. My heart just went into overdrive. Pure, raw terror hit me. Like an electric shock, I froze solid. Sitting there in my sleeping bag, flashlight shaking in my hand, listening to this sound that just shouldn't exist. It felt evil. That's the only word I can think of. Evil. My mind raced. Bear? Mountain lion? But I've heard both. This wasn't either of those. This was something else. Something wrong. Adrenaline started pumping. Survival instinct kicked in. I knew I had to get out of the tent, needed to see what was out there, even though every fiber of my being was screaming at me to stay put, to hide, to disappear. I reached for my knife, always keep it strapped to my thigh when I'm sleeping in the woods. Just a big hunting knife, but it felt like a toothpick against whatever made that sound. I grabbed my flashlight, aimed it at the tent flap, unzipped it as slowly and quietly as I could. Pitch black outside. Like can't see your hand in front of your face, black. And fog, thick, soupy fog that seemed to swallow the beam of my flashlight. The air was heavy, damp, and still ice cold. The creek gurgled, but everything else was dead silent, except for my own breathing, which sounded way too loud in the silence. I took a deep breath, forced myself to step out of the tent, swiveled the flashlight around. Just fog, trees, barely visible through the fog. Everything looked distorted. like the fog was bending the light, making things look twisted and wrong. And then it happened again. Another scream, closer this time, way closer, maybe 50 yards, maybe less. It came from the woods on the other side of the creek. Same sound, exactly the same. High-pitched scream turning into that monstrous growl. But this time I heard something else after the growl. Heavy footsteps, cracking branches, moving away, on two legs. I know it was on two legs. The way it moved, the rhythm of the footsteps, definitely two legs. Something big, something heavy. Crashing through the underbrush, heading deeper into the woods. That was it. Panic finally broke through. I didn't stop to think. I didn't stop to analyze. I just reacted. Every hunting instinct I had, every wilderness survival thing I'd ever learned, just went out the window. All I wanted to do was get away. Get as far away as possible from that sound, from whatever was out there. My boat. My little aluminum fishing boat was parked right by the creek. That was my way out. But I had this weird thought, like a stupid instinct in the middle of all this terror. My phone was in the tent. Might as well take pictures. Of what? I don't know. The fog? The woods? My campsite? It was like some dumb, pointless urge to document something, even if it was just my last moments. Morbid curiosity, maybe, or just plain stupidity from being scared out of my mind. I scrambled back into the tent, grabbed my phone. Hands shaking so bad I could barely work the screen. Unlocked it, opened the camera app, took a couple of blurry pictures of the inside of the tent, then fumbled out again. Took a picture of my campfire, just glowing embers in the fog. Took a picture of the woods in front of me, just blackness and fog swallowing the flashlight beam. They're probably all useless. Who knows why I did it? Then I went into hyperdrive, tore down the tent, didn't bother folding it, just ripped out the stakes, collapsed it into a heap, threw everything inside, sleeping bag, clothes, gear, everything. Just bundled it all up as fast as I could, dragged it over to the boat, started throwing stuff in, backpack, cooler, fishing gear, the rolled-up tent, everything. Fumbled with the motor, thankful it was a pull start and not electric because my hands were shaking too bad to even hit a button straight. Choked it, pulled, nothing. Second pull, sputtered. Third pull, it roared to life, thank God. Untied the boat, pushed off from the bank, jumped in, shoved the throttle forward. The little motor screamed and the boat lurched into the creek, heading downstream, away from the camp, away from the sound. The creek was narrow, twisting and turning. Overhanging branches whipped at my face. Couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me because of the fog. But I didn't care, just had to get out. Had to keep moving. The motor was loud, roaring through the still night. Probably echoing for miles in the quiet woods. But I didn't care about that either. Didn't care about waking up anyone, if there even was anyone to wake up out here. I just needed to create distance between me and whatever was back there in the woods. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle of leaves in the fog sounded like footsteps. Every bend in the creek felt like it could be an ambush. My heart was still pounding. Adrenaline still surging, even with the wind in my face and the boat speeding downstream. Then the thought came. Bigfoot. Stupid, right? Bigfoot. A joke. Something you laugh about with your buddies around a campfire, not something you actually believe in. I'd always rolled my eyes at those stories, dismissed them as made-up nonsense. But now, in the freezing cold fog, with that sound still echoing in my memory, it didn't seem so funny anymore. What else could make a sound like that? What else could be that big, that powerful, to scream like that and then move like a freight train through the woods on two legs? Bear wouldn't scream like that. Mountain lion wouldn't scream like that. Human, maybe a person in terrible pain. But that growl, that ungodly growl, no human could make that sound. The more I thought about it, the more the idea of Bigfoot, of some unknown terrifying creature lurking in the woods, started to make a sick kind of sense. It was crazy. It was unbelievable. But it was the only thing that even remotely fit what I'd heard. Every shadow on the bank now looked like a hulking figure. Every tree trunk seemed to morph into a pair of legs. My imagination was running wild, fueled by fear and adrenaline. I kept swiveling my head, scanning the woods, expecting to see something burst out of the fog, to see eyes reflecting in my flashlight beam. Time seemed to stretch and distort. Minutes felt like hours. Each bend in the creek was an eternity of dread. I kept pushing the throttle harder, willing the little motor to go faster, faster. Finally, through the fog, I saw lights. Dock lights. Little strings of lights strung up at the boat dock. Civilization. Safety. Hope. I practically stood up in the boat, steering with one hand and squinting through the fog, willing the lights to get closer. The creek widened and the lights got clearer. The outline of the dock appeared, then the parking lot beyond it. Cars. Real cars. Not my truck parked back in the woods, but other cars. Normal cars. People. I steered the boat towards the dock, cut the engine, and coasted in. Jumped out, pulled the boat onto the ramp. Didn't even bother tying it up properly, just dragged it halfway out of the water. Grabbed my backpack, left everything else in the boat. Just ran up the ramp, across the parking lot, towards the lights of the little marina office building. Door was open, light spilling out. I stumbled inside, blinking in the sudden brightness. A guy behind the counter looked up, startled. "Hey there," he said. "Everything all right?" I just stood there, gasping for breath, heart still hammering, clothes damp and cold, face probably white as a sheet. "Yeah," I managed to croak out. "Yeah, everything's fine. Just needed a place to stay." He raised an eyebrow but didn't push it. "Motel's just up the road," he said, pointing. "Co-Shopton Motel, can't miss it, open all night." "Thanks," was all I could manage. I stumbled out of the office, back into the night. But now the night felt different, safer, because there were lights and buildings and signs of people. Walked up the road, found the motel, flickering neon sign, vacancy. Just what I needed. Checked in, didn't even care about the price. Just wanted a room, a bed, walls around me, lock on the door. Got to the room, slammed the door shut, locked it, deadbolted it, leaned against the door, just breathing. Trying to slow my heart rate down, trying to make sense of what had happened. Took a shower, hot as I could stand it, trying to wash away the cold, the fear, the sound. Changed into clean clothes, sat on the bed, stared at the wall. Couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that scream again. Saw the blackness, the fog, the trees, felt the bone-chilling terror. I stayed awake all night. Just sitting there, staring at the wall, listening to the traffic noise outside, the hum of the air conditioner, normal, everyday sounds. Sounds of civilization, safe sounds. When the sun finally came up, I felt a little better, a little less raw. But the fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach. Packed my stuff, checked out of the motel, drove home. Haven't been back to the woods since. Haven't even thought about hunting. My gear is still in the boat down at that dock. Haven't had the guts to go back and get it. Maybe I never will. I don't know what it was out there. I don't want to know. Part of me wants to just forget it ever happened. Pretend it was a nightmare, a hallucination, anything but real. But it felt real. God, it felt so real. And that sound, that scream, I'll never forget it. It's burned into my brain. Every time it's quiet, every time I'm alone in the dark, I hear it again, just a faint echo, a whisper of terror. And I know, deep down, whatever made that sound is still out there, in those woods, waiting. And I don't ever want to hear it again, ever. Story 2. It was pitch black, the kind of darkness that feels thick, like you could reach out and grab handfuls of it. We pulled up to the trailhead, the gravel crunching under the tires of John's truck. Way too loud for that time of morning, felt like we were announcing ourselves to the entire mountain. It was early, real early, still before dawn in Belmont Hills. Me, John, Mike and Dave were geared up for a bow hunt. We were after deer mostly. Maybe if we got lucky, a wild turkey. We'd scouted this area a couple of times before, looked promising, good signs, decent tracks. But you never really know until you're out there when it's game time. The moment we cut the engines, the silence of the woods hit you. It wasn't just quiet, it was empty. You know, usually, even that early, you'd hear crickets, maybe some little rustling in the leaves, normal night noises settling down before morning wakes up. But this was different. It felt like the woods were holding their breath. We were just starting to unload our gear, bows, quivers, backpacks, when we heard it. A barred owl. Hoo-hoo, hoo-hoo, hoo-hoo. Classic, right? Woodsy, peaceful, except it was way too close, like right above us. And then another one answered, just as close, but from a different direction. Hoo-hoo, hoo-hoo, hoo-hoo. They were practically on top of each other, these owls yelling back and forth. Now, I've hunted these woods for years, grew up doing it with my dad. I know what barred owls sound like, they're common here. But something felt off. They were loud, insistent, almost mocking. It's hard to explain. It's like when something sounds almost right, but you can just tell it's not quite natural, you know? Like a slightly off-key note in a song, just enough to make your ear twitch. Mike, he was the first to say something. "Those owls are sure chatty this morning," he mumbled, fiddling with the straps on his quiver. John just shrugged, shouldered his bow. Dave didn't say anything, but he was looking up into the trees, scanning the branches with his headlamp. I was doing the same, trying to spot them, but the canopy was thick, blocking out what little starlight there was. I couldn't shake the feeling something was weird. And then, stupid as it sounds, local folklore popped into my head. Bigfoot stories. I know, sounds ridiculous. But this area, Belmont Hills, is prime Bigfoot territory according to the old-timers around here. And I remembered some stories, things I'd half listened to, mostly dismissed as campfire tales. But one stuck, about how some folks claimed Bigfoot could imitate animal sounds, badly, like a clumsy impressionist. And owls, apparently, were a common one, but they'd always sound just a little bit wrong. I kept that to myself, though, didn't want to sound like a crazy person right off the bat. We started walking up the trail, deeper into the woods. The owl calls kept going, now seemingly following us, still those two, going back and forth, still way too loud, way too close. It was unsettling, even for guys like us who were used to being out in the woods in the dark. And then came the branches. Snap, crackle, like someone stepping on dry twigs, the kind you get in late fall. Except it was late summer, and the forest floor was damp from the dew. It wasn't just one snap. It was a series, behind us, off the trail to our left. Like footsteps, heavy footsteps. We all froze, stopped dead in our tracks. The owl calls stopped too, abruptly. Just silence again. Except now, it was a different kind of silence. A heavy silence. A waiting silence. "Did you guys hear that?" Mike whispered, his voice tighter than before. "Yeah," Dave breathed, his headlamp beam darting back and forth across the tree line behind us. John just nodded, his eyes narrowed, his hand instinctively tightening around his bow riser. We stood there, maybe for a minute, holding our breath, listening. Nothing. Just the faint hum in my ears, the thumping of my own pulse starting to pick up speed. We figured it was probably just a deer, maybe a bear rooting around off the trail. Happens all the time. So we started moving again, quieter this time, walking single file. And the snapping started again, almost immediately. Snap, crackle, still behind us, still keeping pace. And then I heard another sound underneath the snaps and crackles, a rustling like brush being pushed aside, like something big moving through the undergrowth. Not crashing, but purposeful, controlled. This wasn't a deer or a bear. Those animals, they aren't quiet. They blunder. They crash. This was something else. Something stealthy. We stopped again. And just like before, the sounds behind us stopped too. The owls remained silent. Just that heavy, suffocating stillness. It was like whatever was back there was mirroring us, playing a game. "Okay," John said, his voice low and serious. "This ain't right." He was looking behind us, into the dark woods, his face grim. Let's just keep moving. Stay together." We started walking again, faster this time, our steps lighter, trying to be as quiet as possible ourselves. But it didn't matter. The snapping and rustling started again, following us, still behind us, still mirroring our movements. Stop, they stop. Walk, they walk. My heart was starting to hammer in my chest. This was going beyond unsettling. This was creeping me the hell out, and I could see it in the others too. Mike was pale, his eyes wide. Dave kept glancing back over his shoulder, his hand now resting on the arrow nocked on his bowstring. John, he was trying to look calm, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he was scanning the woods, like he expected something to jump out at any second. We walked like that for what felt like forever, but was probably only half an hour, maybe less. Up the trail, deeper and deeper into the woods, the snapping and rustling always behind us. The owl calls hadn't started up again, thank God. But the silence now felt worse, like the forest itself was holding its breath, watching us, waiting. Then we reached a small clearing, a little plateau, a wider spot on the trail. We stopped there instinctively, needing a break, a moment to gather ourselves, catch our breath. We were out of the thickest part of the trees for a bit, some open sky above us now. The stars were starting to fade, the first hint of pre-dawn grey creeping in on the eastern horizon. We stood there, huddled together in a tight little group, backs to each other, scanning the darkness that surrounded the clearing. Just huddled in the truck, listening to the sounds of the night, straining to hear over the pounding of my own heart. The woods were quiet again. Just the insects, the normal night sounds. But I could still feel it, that presence, that feeling of dread, still hanging in the air. Finally, I started the truck, put it in gear, and just floored it. Sped back down Old County Road 27, tires spitting gravel, headlights cutting through the darkness, not stopping, not slowing down, until I was back on the main highway, miles away from that place, miles away from Shadow Creek Bridge. I didn't stop driving until I was home. I went inside, locked the doors, and just sat on the couch, still shaking. I didn't sleep that night, just stayed up staring at the ceiling, replaying it all in my head, over and over again, trying to make sense of it, trying to tell myself it was a nightmare, a hallucination, anything but what it looked like, what it felt like. But it was real. I knew it was real. I'd seen it, those eyes, that form, coming out of Shadow Creek. And now, here I was, a year later, back near Shadow Creek, back at the mouth of it, on Oak Haven Lake, in Elias's boat. And that memory, that terror just crashed back over me with full force. Seeing that creek, seeing those trees, the way the light was hitting the water, it was exactly the same as that night. I grabbed Elias's arm hard, startling him. "We gotta go," I said, my voice shaking. "Elias, we gotta get out of here now." He looked at me, surprised, confused. "What? What's wrong, man? We just got here. The logjam is just around the corner." "No, Elias, we can't. We have to go back. Now, please." My voice was almost a whisper, barely under control. I could feel the panic rising, choking me. He saw my face then. He saw something in my eyes. He's known me long enough to know when I'm not messing around. He saw the real fear in my face. He stopped the boat, engine idling, looking at me, his eyebrows furrowed. "Marcus, what the hell is going on? You're white as a ghost. What's wrong?" I couldn't tell him. Not right there. Not then. The words just wouldn't come. The memory was too raw, too visceral. All I could do was shake my head, my chest heaving, pointing back towards the boat ramp, back down the lake. "Just, please, Elias, please, we have to go, now." He hesitated for another second. Then he nodded slowly, finally seeing how serious I was. He didn't ask again. He just turned the boat around, gunned the engine, and we sped back down Oak Haven Lake, away from Shadow Creek, away from that place. I didn't say a word the whole way back, just sat there, huddled in the front of the boat, staring straight ahead, trying to breathe, trying to calm the hammering in my chest, the cold sweat on my skin. When we got back to the ramp, he cut the engine, and we drifted into the dock. He turned to me, his face still worried. "Marcus, man, what was that all about? You scared the crap out of me back there. What happened?" I finally managed to get the words out, broken, shaky, but I told him. Everything. About last year, about Shadow Creek Bridge, about walking into the woods that night, about the rustling, the splash, and about what I saw, about those eyes. He listened, his face getting paler and paler as I talked. He's a rational guy, Elias, not prone to flights of fancy, but he could see I was serious. He could see the genuine terror still in my eyes. He knew me well enough to know I wasn't making it up. When I finished, there was silence for a long time, just the sounds of the lake, the water lapping against the dock, the birds in the trees. Elias finally spoke, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. "Marcus, I don't know what to say, man. I've never heard you talk about anything like that before, and I know you wouldn't just make something like that up." He looked out towards the lake, towards the direction of Shadow Creek, a troubled look on his face. "I've heard stories," he said slowly, almost to himself. "Old stories around here, about the woods, about things out there. Things people see sometimes, way back in the woods, things they don't talk about." He turned back to me, his eyes searching mine. "You really saw something, huh? Something big, with glowing eyes?" I just nodded, unable to speak. The memory was still too fresh, too real, too terrifying. The feeling of dread hadn't completely gone away. It was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, a lingering chill on my skin. Elias put a hand on my shoulder, a reassuring gesture. "Well, man," he said softly, "I'm glad we got out of there, whatever it was. I'm glad we're back here." We packed up the boat in silence, neither of us saying much more. The mood was completely gone. The fun, relaxed feeling of the morning just vanished, replaced by something heavy, uneasy, something unspoken hanging in the air between us. I haven't been back to Oakhaven Lake since. I don't think I ever will be. Not to that part of the lake, not near Shadow Creek. And I sure as hell haven't been back to Old County Road 27 or Shadow Creek Bridge at night, or any woods at night for that matter. Sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet and I close my eyes, I still see them, those eyes, glowing amber in the darkness, staring at me. And I hear the rustling, the branches breaking, the heavy breathing, and I feel that same cold, primal terror grip me all over again. I still don't know what it was. I don't want to know. Some things are better left unknown, I guess. Some woods, some places. They just hold things that maybe humans weren't meant to see. And Shadow Creek. Shadow Creek holds something that still chills me to the bone, just thinking about it. And I don't think that feeling will ever really go away. For a moment, just a moment, there was nothing. Complete silence. Relief, maybe. A tiny flicker of hope that whatever had been following us had given up, gone away. And then it happened. It started as a low growl deep in the woods off to our left. A rumbling, guttural sound, like a massive engine turning over but struggling to start. It was low frequency. You could feel it vibrating in your chest, in the ground beneath your feet. It wasn't like any animal growl I'd ever heard. Bears growl, mountain lions growl, even deer sometimes make weird noises when they're scared. But this was different, bigger, deeper, meaner. And then it erupted. It wasn't just a growl anymore, it was a scream. But not like a human scream, or an animal scream. It was something else entirely. It ripped through the silence of the pre-dawn woods like a physical force, a wave of sound that hit you, that slammed into you and stole the air from your lungs. It was loud, ear-splitting loud, but it wasn't just the volume, it was the quality of it. It was raw, primal, utterly savage. It was filled with rage, with pain, with something else I couldn't even name, something ancient and terrible. It was a sound that clawed at your insides, that burrowed into your bones and set your teeth on edge. My breath hitched in my throat, every muscle in my body locked up, spasmed tight. The hairs on my arms, on the back of my neck, stood straight up like needles. My heart slammed against my ribs, trying to beat its way out of my chest. Fear, pure, white-hot, paralyzing fear flooded through me. I've never felt anything like it, not in my life. I'm sure my buddies felt it too. I could see it in their faces, frozen in the flickering light of our headlamps. Mike's eyes were bugged out, wide and terrified. Dave's face was ashen, grey as death. John's mouth was hanging open, his eyes fixed on the darkness where the scream had come from. We were all statues, frozen solid, our bows clutched in white-knuckled grips, but utterly useless, utterly defenseless against whatever had just unleashed that sound. The scream went on and on, seemed to last forever, though it was probably only seconds, maybe 10, 15 at most. But in that time it felt like reality itself had twisted, warped around us. The woods weren't the woods anymore. They were something else, something hostile, something evil. And then, just as abruptly as it started, it stopped. Silence. But this silence was different again. Not heavy, not waiting. This was dead silence. A silence that felt empty, drained, like all the sound in the world had been sucked away, leaving nothing but a vacuum. We stood there, frozen, our breath coming in ragged gasps, our hearts pounding like war drums. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The silence pressed down on us, thick and suffocating. We didn't move, didn't speak, barely even dared to breathe. Finally Dave, his voice trembling, broke the silence. What the hell was that? Nobody answered. What could we say? We didn't have a clue. Bear? Mike whispered, but even he didn't sound convinced. John shook his head slowly, still staring into the darkness. No, not a bear. His voice was rough, strained. Not any bear I ever heard. I swallowed hard, my throat dry as dust. Sounded, I don't know, almost human, but not. I was grasping at straws, trying to find some kind of explanation, something to make sense of the unholy sound we'd just heard. Dave was swaying slightly, his face still white. I don't like this. I really don't like this. Panic was creeping into his voice now. Let's get out of here. Come on, guys. Let's just go. Mike nodded quickly, eagerly. Yeah, let's go. Let's go right now. He was already starting to turn, ready to bolt back down the trail, but John didn't move. And surprisingly, neither did I. I was terrified, yeah. Scared shitless, to be honest. But there was something else too. Curiosity, stubbornness, maybe just dumb male pride. We'd come all this way, hiked this far in the dark, been planning this hunt for weeks. Were we really going to let some sound scare us off? Hold on, I said, my voice shaking a little, but trying to sound more confident than I felt. We came here to hunt. We're armed. We're 4 grown men. Whatever that was, it's probably gone now, scared off by its own screaming. God, I sounded ridiculous even to myself. Dave just looked at me like I was insane. Scared off? Mark, are you crazy? That thing sounded like it wanted to rip us apart. Yeah, Mark's right, John said slowly, surprisingly backing me up. He was still looking into the woods, but his eyes were sharper now, more focused. Running isn't going to help. Whatever that was, it knows we're here. Running might just make it chase us. He had a point. Running in the dark, in thick woods, with something like that maybe following us. Yeah, no thanks. But what do we do? Mike asked, his voice small. We can't just stay here, not after that. We stick together, John said, his voice firm now. He was taking charge the way he always did in situations like this. We stay alert. We keep our eyes and ears open, and we move slowly. We came here to hunt. Let's see if we can still salvage the day. But we stick together. No one goes off on their own. Got it? Dave and Mike still looked terrified, but they nodded. They didn't have any better ideas. And honestly, despite the fear gnawing at me, I didn't want to just run away either. Not yet. We stood there for a few more minutes, listening, scanning the woods, our hearts still pounding, our nerves still screaming. But the silence held. No more screams, no more growls, no more snapping branches. Just the dead, empty silence of the woods. Slowly, cautiously, we started moving again. Not back down the trail, but deeper into the woods, in the direction where the scream had come from. Not towards it exactly, but kind of angling that way, moving along the edge of the plateau, parallel to where we thought it had been. The forest felt different now. Wrong. The silence was heavier than before. The air felt colder, almost electric. It was like the scream had changed something, had tainted the woods, had infused them with a sense of dread, of malevolence that wasn't there before. We walked like ghosts, our steps slow and deliberate, our senses on high alert, straining to hear, to see, anything. But there was nothing. No animal sounds, no rustling leaves, not even the wind in the trees. It was like everything had gone silent, had gone still, holding its breath, waiting for something else to happen. We hunted that day, technically. We walked, we scanned, we watched. But it wasn't hunting. Not really. It was more like survival. We were just going through the motions, our minds miles away, replaying that scream, jumping at every shadow, every whisper of sound. We didn't see any deer, didn't see any turkeys, didn't see any animals at all, come to think of it. The woods were empty, completely unnaturally empty. By mid-morning we'd had enough. The fear hadn't lessened, hadn't faded. It had just settled in, a cold knot in our stomachs, a constant prickle on our skin. The silence, the emptiness, the lingering echo of that scream. It was too much. We turned around, started heading back towards the truck. And the strangest thing? The woods behind us stayed silent. No more snapping branches, no more rustling, no more feeling of being watched. It was like whatever had been stalking us, whatever had screamed, it was gone, vanished, leaving only the silence and the lingering dread in its wake. We walked out of those woods faster than we'd ever walked before. Didn't stop until we were back at the truck, doors locked, engine running, tires spitting gravel as we tore out of there. We never talked about it much after that. Not really. We joked about it sometimes, nervously, made cracks about bears with sore throats, or maybe mountain lions learning opera. But underneath the jokes, the fear was still there. I know it was for me. I still get chills thinking about that scream, that sound that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the natural world. We never went back to hunt in Belmont Hills again, not to that part of the woods anyway. Maybe it was just a bear, maybe it was a mountain lion, maybe it was something else entirely, something we couldn't even begin to understand. I don't know. I still don't know, and honestly, I don't think I ever want to know. Some questions are better left unanswered, some doors are better left unopened in the dark. And that scream in Belmont Hills? That's one door I'm happy to leave slammed shut forever, because whatever was behind it, it wasn't natural, it wasn't right. And I'm damn glad we got out of there when we did. I still hear that scream sometimes in my nightmares. And I still wake up in a cold sweat, heart pounding, and the silence of my bedroom feels just a little bit too much like the silence of those woods that morning. A silence that remembers, a silence that waits. Story 3. It was a beautiful Saturday, the kind you just crave after a week of staring at spreadsheets. My son, Mikey, who's obsessed with anything even remotely historical, had been begging me to take him arrowhead hunting ever since he read some local blog about Burr Oak Park being a decent spot. Honestly, I'm not much of an outdoorsy person. Give me a bookstore and a coffee shop any day. But Mikey's enthusiasm is contagious, and my brother Dan was free too, so I thought, why not? Family time and fresh air, right? Sounded perfect in theory. We packed a lunch, sunscreen, bug spray, the whole 9 yards and headed out. Burr Oak Park is nice, not too crowded, plenty of trees, that typical woodsy smell, you know, damp earth and pine needles. We found a trail that looked promising, not too steep, and started walking. Mikey was practically vibrating with excitement, eyes glued to the ground, kicking at leaves like he expected to trip over a whole box of arrowheads. We'd been walking for maybe half an hour, the sun dappling through the trees, birds chirping, idyllic, truly. Dan was chatting about some work thing. I was only half listening, mostly just enjoying the peace and quiet. Mikey suddenly veered off the main trail. "Mom, look!" he shouted, pointing down a little slope. "This looks like a good spot. More dirt." It was just a slight incline, not really a proper hill, more like the land just dipped a bit. Covered in the same kind of trees and undergrowth as everywhere else, but I could see what Mikey meant. Maybe less leaf cover on the ground, more exposed earth. Dan and I exchanged a look, a little shrug, and followed him down. It was quiet there, even quieter than the main trail. The bird song seemed fainter, the air felt stiller. I didn't think much of it at the time, just figured we were a little further into the woods now. Mikey was already on his hands and knees, diligently sifting through the dirt, chattering about the kinds of rocks Native Americans used to make arrowheads. He knows a surprising amount of random facts for a 10-year-old. Dan and I wandered a little, pretending to help, but really just letting Mikey have his moment. Then Dan stopped. He wasn't looking at the ground anymore. He was staring off into the trees to our left, his eyebrows furrowed. "Hey, Janet, you see that?" he murmured, not wanting to spook Mikey, I guess. I followed his gaze. At first, I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Just more trees, bushes, the usual woodland clutter. "See what?" I whispered back, feeling a tiny prickle of unease just because of his tone. He pointed again, more precisely this time, into a denser patch of bushes. "Over there. That weird thing." I squinted, trying to focus, and then I saw it. Partially hidden behind some leafy branches was something. It was hard to make out at first. It looked like a messy pile of sticks and branches kind of woven together. Like a nest, but way too big. We slowly moved closer, stepping carefully over fallen logs and avoiding snapping twigs too loudly. As we got nearer, the shape became clearer. It was a structure, definitely. Rough, primitive, but deliberately built. Branches and thick sticks all interwoven, creating a kind of rounded, cage-like shape. It wasn't neat or symmetrical, more like organic, like it had grown out of the woods itself. But it was clearly constructed. "What is that?" Mikey asked, finally noticing we were looking at something besides the ground. He came over, peering at the structure with curiosity. I don't know, buddy," Dan said, his voice quiet. "Looks like some kind of shelter." It was bigger than a doghouse, smaller than a proper shed. It was open on one side, forming a sort of rough entrance. The whole thing was made of natural materials, just branches and twigs and leaves, but it was tightly packed and surprisingly solid-looking. It didn't look like kids had built it as a fort. It felt intentional. "Looks like a hunting blind," I said, though even as the words came out of my mouth, they felt wrong. Hunting blind for what? This is Burr Oak Park. It's illegal to hunt here. And this thing, it wasn't a typical hunting blind. Those are usually elevated platforms or simple screens to hide behind. This was different, more enclosed, more substantial. A wave of discomfort washed over me. It wasn't just the weird structure itself, it was the feeling of the place. That stillness, that quiet. It felt watched. I know it sounds crazy now, even writing it down, but that's exactly how it felt, like something was observing us from the trees. I started scanning the area around the structure, my eyes moving slowly, trying to penetrate the shadows under the trees. "This is creepy," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. This isn't right. This isn't a human thing, is it? I don't even know why I said that. It just felt off, like instinctively wrong. Dan was looking around too, his gaze sharp and alert. He's ex-military, always more aware of his surroundings than me. I don't know, Jan, he said slowly. Could be just some weirdo building stuff, but yeah, it's odd. Mikey was getting impatient. Can we look inside? Maybe there are arrowheads in there. He started to move towards the open side of the structure, his kid curiosity overriding any sense of unease. Mikey, wait, I said, grabbing his arm. Hold on a second. I didn't want him going near it. I couldn't explain why, just a gut feeling, a sudden, strong instinct to keep him away. I had my small monocular in my backpack. I'd brought it along thinking maybe we'd spot some interesting birds or something equally mundane. Now I fumbled for it, my hands feeling clumsy and slightly shaky. I pulled it out, extended it, and started to focus it on the area around the strange structure. I scanned slowly, deliberately, tree by tree, bush by bush. Nothing, just leaves, branches, sunlight filtering through the canopy. My heart was starting to pound in my chest, a tight, anxious rhythm. I felt ridiculous, using a monocular to look for, what, monsters? It was just a weird little hut, probably made by some teenagers. I was being paranoid. I was about to lower the monocular to tell myself to relax, that I was imagining things. And then I saw it, deep in the shadows, between the trunks of two thick trees. Something dark. Just a patch of deeper darkness, almost like a hole in the woods. At first, I thought it was just shadow, my eyes playing tricks on me. But then it moved. It was a shape. A dark, indistinct shape, just barely visible in the gloom. Too solid to be a shadow, too still to be an animal. And it was watching us. I could feel it. Even through the monocular, even from this distance, I could feel the weight of its gaze. My breath hitched in my throat. I couldn't make out details, the light was too poor, and the trees obscured too much. But it was there. Something was there, lurking in the shadows, watching us from the trees below. Before I could even process what I was seeing, before I could focus the monocular properly, it moved again. Quickly, silently, it shifted deeper into the shadows, disappearing behind the thick trunks. Gone. There's something down there, I stammered, my voice trembling, my eyes wide with fear. I lowered the monocular, my hand shaking so badly I almost dropped it. Down there, in the trees, I saw something, watching us. Dan's head snapped up, his eyes instantly alert, scanning the area where I'd been looking. What? What did you see? He asked urgently. I don't know, I said, my voice still shaking. Something dark, in the shadows. It was watching us. Then it went behind the trees. I was struggling to articulate what I'd just witnessed, my mind racing, trying to make sense of the fleeting glimpse. Where exactly? Dan asked, his voice low and serious. He took a step forward, peering into the woods. Show me. I pointed, my finger trembling. Over there, between those two big trees. See those thick trunks close together? Just beyond them, in the shadows. I was trying to describe the location, trying to guide his eyes to where I'd seen the dark shape. As I was speaking, as I was pointing, it reappeared. Suddenly, silently, it was there again. Just for a moment. Just a glimpse. Peeking out from behind the side of one of the thick trees, its form still obscured by shadows and foliage. Like it was checking if we were still there. Spying on us. This time, it was a little clearer. Not much, but a little. It was a shape. Vaguely humanoid, tall and dark. It was angled away from us, mostly hidden by the tree, but I could see the edge of it, the outline. And then the light shifted, or maybe it moved slightly, I don't know. And I saw it. Emerging from the side of the tree trunk, reaching around it, was an arm, not like a branch, not like an animal's leg. An arm, covered in dark, coarse hair, and a hand, a huge hand, shaped like a human hand, but massively oversized, thick, long fingers, gripping the tree trunk with incredible strength. The fingers were thick as my wrist. I froze. My breath completely left my lungs. My blood turned to ice. It was the hand that did it. The hand made it real. Before that, it was just a shadow, a shape, something indistinct and possibly imagined. But the hand was undeniable. It was real. It was monstrous. It was watching us. Time seemed to stop. I was paralyzed, staring, my mind completely blank with terror. The hand gripped the tree trunk, those massive fingers digging into the bark, and for that split second, everything else faded away. Just the hand, the monstrous hand, watching us. And then the scream ripped out of me, not a scream of pain, not a scream of surprise, a scream of pure, unadulterated, primal terror, a scream that came from the deepest part of me, from a place beyond thought, beyond reason, a scream that just erupted from my very soul. "Go, go, go!" I shrieked, my voice hoarse, unrecognizable. I shoved Mikey in front of me, practically throwing him towards the trail. "Run! Now! Run!" Dan reacted instantly. He grabbed Mikey's hand, pulling him forward, and started sprinting back towards the main trail, towards safety, towards escape. I stumbled after them, my legs moving mechanically, driven by pure panic. I didn't look back. I didn't dare look back. I just ran as fast as I could, my lungs burning, my heart hammering, my mind screaming, "Get out, get out, get out!" We burst back onto the main trail, gasping for breath, adrenaline coursing through our veins. Other people were there, hikers, families, just enjoying their Saturday afternoon in the park. They turned to look at us, startled by our sudden frantic arrival. I'm sure we looked insane, wild-eyed and pale, tearing out of the woods like we were being chased by, well, we were being chased by something. Something I couldn't explain. Something I still can't explain. We didn't stop running until we were back at the parking lot, back at the car. We piled in, doors locked, windows rolled up, and I just sat there, shaking, trying to catch my breath, my heart still pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. Mikey was crying, scared and confused. Dan was breathing heavily, his face pale but determined. "What the hell was that, Jan?" he asked, his voice strained. "What did you see?" I just shook my head, tears streaming down my face. I don't know," I whispered, my voice still trembling. "I don't know. But it was real, Dan. It was real." We drove home in silence, the car filled with a heavy, unspoken fear. Mikey eventually calmed down, falling asleep in the back seat, exhausted and traumatized. Dan and I didn't talk much. What could we say? How do you explain something like that? Something that defies explanation. We haven't been back to Burr Oak Park since. I can't even think about it without feeling that icy grip of terror in my chest again. Sometimes at night, I still see it in my mind's eye. That hand, gripping the tree, watching us from the shadows. I tell myself it was a bear, a weird, skinny bear standing on its hind legs, its paw just looking deformed in the shadows. I tried to rationalize it, to make it fit into some kind of logical box, but deep down, I know it wasn't a bear, it wasn't an animal, it was something else, something dark and unknown, lurking in the woods, and it saw us. And sometimes, when it's really quiet, I wonder if it's still out there in the shadows of Burr Oak Park, watching, waiting, and I wonder if it's ever watched us before, without us knowing, and I shiver. Because the woods suddenly don't feel so peaceful anymore. They feel watchful and hungry. And that thought, that feeling, it stays with me. It just stays. Story 4. I still can't really wrap my head around what I saw that day. It feels like it was years ago, but it was just this last January. Everything still feels off. Mom had just passed. And Dad, well, Dad hasn't been quite himself for a while, you know. He gets confused easily. My sister and her husband came by to check on him, and on me, I guess. It's funny, even when you're the one dealing with everything, people always seem to think of you second, after the person who's suffering. Not that I begrudged them coming. It was nice to see a friendly face, even though their visit mostly just reminded me of everything that was missing. Anyway, they left around dusk. It was that kind of late afternoon in January, the air biting cold, and the light already starting to fade behind the bare trees. We live out in Noble Creek, way out, practically in the middle of nowhere. My childhood home, same as Dad's and his dad's before him. It's surrounded by land, mostly fields that haven't been properly worked in years, just left to go wild, and then the woods start up behind the house. We've got the old outbuildings still standing, falling apart more each year, and then the fences. Miles of those old wire fences, mostly rusting, some barbed wire sections still sharp, marking off what was once pasture. After my sister left, Dad was already starting to wander back inside, lost in his own world. I told him I was just going to shut the gate, make sure it was latched good for the night. It's an old habit. Dad always made sure the gates were shut. Keeps the deer out of what's left of the garden, he used to say, but honestly, there's nothing left of the garden now either. Still, I went out there. I remember pulling my coat tighter around me, that sharp, dry cold that cuts right through you even if you're bundled up. The ground was hard, patches of old snow and ice still hanging on in the shadows, making it slick in places. As I walked down the short drive to the main gate, I glanced towards the side of the house, towards the old barn. That's when I saw it. At first, I honestly thought it was a man, someone tall, really tall, walking along the fence line that runs between the field and the woods, heading towards the barn. It was starting to get pretty dim out, the kind of light where everything looks grey and washed out. My first thought was just some lost hiker or something. Happens sometimes, people wandering off trails getting disoriented. Noble Creek is near a few state parks, but something felt wrong immediately. The way it was moving, slow, deliberate steps, and the direction. Why would anyone be walking along the fence line, heading towards the barn? There's nothing out there except the woods, and then the height. As it got closer to one of the corner fence posts, it started to hit me. Those posts are high. I mean seriously high. Dad and I put those in ourselves a few years back, treated wood, sunk deep. They're easily 8 feet, maybe more, sticking out of the ground. This thing towered over them. I mean way over, like it was walking next to a bunch of garden stakes. That's when the penny really dropped. It wasn't a man, not even close. This thing was gigantic. I'm not talking about a tall guy. I'm talking like monstrously tall. I stared, just stopped dead in my tracks, my breath catching in my throat. It kept walking, slow, steady, right along the fence. And as it moved past the posts, post after post, each one dwarfed by its height, the scale of it started to sink in. This wasn't just tall, this was impossibly tall. And then I noticed the color. It wasn't wearing clothes, not like a person. That grayness I'd first thought was a coat wasn't fabric. It was fur, hair, something like that, covering it head to toe. A dull, greyish colour, blending into the winter landscape almost. It was hard to make out details in the fading light, but as it moved, I could see this matted, coarse-looking grey stuff covering its whole body. It seemed to be moving carefully, like it was unsure of its footing on the icy ground. A little hesitant in each step, like it was worried about slipping. And it hadn't seen me yet. Didn't seem to be aware of anything around it except for the ground in front of it. It was just moving along the fence line, towards our barn. A cold, sharp dread went right through me, colder than the air. It wasn't just fear. It was something deeper, something primal. A memory flickering at the edge of my mind. Years ago, something similar. I was a kid, maybe 10 or 11. Something in the woods behind the house then, something my older brother and I swore we saw. Something tall and dark, glimpsed between the trees. We dismissed it then, kids' imaginations playing too long in the woods. But the feeling, the same cold, gripping fear, it all flooded back. Oh God, no. Not again, I thought, my voice just a whisper lost in the cold air. My legs felt like they were rooted to the ground, frozen, pure terror. That feeling, that absolute gut-wrenching fear, that's the worst. It just paralyzes you, like your brain short-circuits and all that's left is this icy coldness and the pounding of your heart in your ears. But this time was different. This thing was closer, clearer, and bigger, so much bigger, and older looking somehow. That grey fur, or whatever it was, looked faded, almost, like old, worn-out plush. Not sleek or strong, but aged. Like this creature was ancient. Standing there, watching it get closer to the barn, that icy dread started to turn into something else. A kind of desperate defiance. I don't know where it came from. Maybe just pure panic. But something snapped in me. I couldn't just stand there and watch it come closer. Not again. Not here. My voice came out shaky, thin, but loud enough to cut through the stillness of the evening. Hey, hey, what do you think you're doing? The sound ripped through the air, and the effect was instant. The creature stopped, just stopped in its tracks like it had run into a brick wall. It froze, completely still. Then slowly it started to turn its head. It turned towards me, and that's when I saw its face, or what I guess was its face. It was hard to make out details in the shadows, but even in the fading light, those eyes I saw clearly. They were wide, huge, and startled, like it was just as surprised to see me as I was to see it. Its mouth was open a little, like it was caught mid-breath, and it was staring right at me. Those eyes, they were dark, deep pools of black. No shine, no reflection, just blackness. And they were wide, so wide they showed white all around them like a terrified animal's eyes. It wasn't angry, not menacing. It looked scared, like it had been caught doing something it shouldn't. For what felt like a lifetime, but was probably only a few seconds, we just stared at each other. Me, frozen in terror, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. And it, this giant, monstrous thing standing there stock still, its huge black eyes locked on mine, filled with surprise and something else, something like fear. Then, in a movement so fast it was almost a blur, it turned, just wheeled around, pivoting on one huge foot. And then it ran back the way it had come, towards the woods behind the house. Not clumsy, not lumbering like you'd expect something that big to move. It was fast. It moved with surprising speed and agility, even on that icy ground. It didn't look back, didn't hesitate. It just ran. I watched, rooted to the spot, as it crashed away through the underbrush, branches snapping, snow flying. The sounds faded quickly as it disappeared into the darkness of the trees, and then silence, except for the rush of blood in my ears and the ragged sound of my own breath. I stood there for, I don't know how long, just staring at the spot where it had disappeared, my body trembling from head to foot, shaking so hard I could barely stand. Cold, not just from the air, but from something inside me, something deep and bone-chilling. Terror. Slowly, like moving through thick mud, I turned and walked back towards the house. Each step felt heavy, unreal. Everything seemed muted, muffled, like I was underwater, or like the world had shifted somehow, tilted on its axis, and everything was slightly wrong. When I got back to the porch, I fumbled with the door handle, my fingers clumsy and numb. I stumbled inside and shut the door behind me, leaning against it for a moment, gasping for breath. Dad was in the living room, standing by the window, looking out at the yard. He hadn't even seemed to notice I'd been gone. He does that now sometimes, just gets lost in his own head. "You forgot to shut the gate," he said, his voice flat, matter-of-fact, not even looking at me, just staring out the window into the gathering darkness. I just looked at him, unable to speak. The words wouldn't come. How could I explain it? What could I even say? Dad, I just saw something out by the barn. But the words felt ridiculous even in my own head. How do you explain something like that? Something impossible. I looked back at him, at his blank, unseeing stare out the window. He wouldn't understand. He couldn't. And maybe it was better that way. Maybe it was better to just not say anything. I swallowed hard, trying to get the lump out of my throat. Yeah, I managed to say, my voice still shaky. Yeah, I'll go shut the gate now. And I went back outside, back into the cold, back into the darkness. But this time, I wasn't just closing a gate. I was checking. I needed to see if it was real, if I hadn't just imagined the whole thing out of grief or stress or whatever. The ground outside was even darker now, the last bit of daylight completely gone. I walked back down to the gate, my heart still hammering, my eyes scanning the shadows. And then I saw them. Footprints. Giant footprints in the snow and ice. Not like human footprints. Too big, too long, and deep. They were pressed deep into the frozen ground, like something incredibly heavy had stepped there. And they were heading away from the fence, towards the woods. Just like I'd seen it go. I followed them with my eyes, tracing their path to the edge of the trees, where the darkness swallowed them whole. Giant, monstrous footprints, proof that it wasn't a dream, wasn't a hallucination. It was real. It actually happened. And then, the worst part, the part that still sticks with me, the part that keeps me up at night. As I stood there staring at those footprints, a sudden gust of wind swept through the field, rattling the bare branches of the trees and swirling snow around my feet. And for just a second, carried on the wind, I thought I heard something, faint, distant, but like a sound, like breathing, heavy, ragged breathing, coming from the woods. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat again, searching the darkness, straining my ears. But there was nothing, just the wind, the trees, the silence of the winter night. But I swear, for that one moment, I heard it, whatever it was, out there in the dark woods, still there, watching, or listening, or just being. I slammed the gate shut, fumbled with the latch until it clicked into place, and ran back to the house, not stopping until I was safely inside, doors locked, lights on. I haven't been back out there at dusk since, and I still look out the windows at night towards the woods every now and then, just checking. Even though I know whatever it was is still out there, somewhere, in those woods. And sometimes when the wind blows just right, I think I can still hear it. Breathing, just beyond the trees. And I wonder if it's watching me too, and I still can't explain it. Not to anyone, not even myself, really. It just happened, and that's it. It happened and then it was gone. But I know what I saw. I know it was real. And that's what scares me the most, the knowing. The knowing that something like that is out there, and that there's no explanation for it, none at all. Story 5. Look, I don't usually talk about this stuff, especially not online, but seeing some of the things people have posted here, well, it reminded me of something that happened to me a long time ago, something I've tried to push down, pretend didn't happen. But it did, and honestly, thinking about it still messes with my head. It was back in October. Perfect hunting weather, you know? Crisp, cold mornings, leaves turning, that smell of damp earth and pine needles in the air. I was out in Etheria County, deep in the woods. Used to be way more remote back then, less built up. This was on private land, bordering Blackwood State Forest, north of Oakhaven. Place was pretty much nothing but trees for miles in every direction. Perfect spot to get away from it all. Perfect for hunting. I'd been hunting since I was a kid. Bow hunter mostly, loved the challenge, getting up close, respecting the woods. You get it. That morning I was after deer. Found a good spot overlooking a meadow near Norris Creek. Set up my tree stand early before sunrise, got myself situated. It was still pretty dark, just that pre-dawn grey light filtering through the trees. Everything was quiet, still. That's when you really feel in tune with the woods, you know. Waiting, listening, part of it all. Anyway, sunrise came, and the woods started waking up. Birds chirping, squirrels rustling around. Typical morning. I was watching the edge of the meadow, waiting to see some movement, and then I saw it. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't even an animal I recognized at first. From the tree line, over on the far side of the meadow, something dark and big started moving. I mean, big. Like way bigger than any deer I'd ever seen. At first, through the trees, it was just a dark shape. But as it stepped out into the meadow, I could see it clearer. It was hairy, completely covered in dark hair, thick and matted looking. And it was walking upright, like a man, but not. It was massive, just huge. I'm talking, I don't even know, 7, 8 feet tall, maybe more, broad shoulders, thick limbs. It moved with this slow, deliberate stride like it owned the place, like nothing could bother it. My heart started hammering in my chest. I froze, I mean completely frozen, bow in my hand, but I couldn't move. I just stared. I've seen bears in the woods before, even a mountain lion once, but this wasn't anything like that. This was different, wrong somehow. It walked right out into the open meadow. The sun was just starting to hit the field, so it wasn't completely dark anymore. But this thing, it was still dark, almost black, against the pale morning light. It crossed the meadow, just walking like it had a purpose, like it knew exactly where it was going. And then it got to the fence. There was a barbed wire fence at the edge of the meadow, separating the field from a thicket of trees and bushes. Standard farm fence, 4 feet high, maybe a little more. I figured, whatever it was, it would stop there. Animals usually do, right? They find a gap, go around, something. This thing didn't even pause. It walked right up to that fence and just stepped over it. Stepped over, like it was nothing. No jump, no effort, just lifted its leg and stepped over all 4 strands of barbed wire like it was a curb. 1 step, and it was on the other side, and then it just kept walking, disappearing into the thick bushes on the other side. I watched it go, just stood there in my tree stand, not breathing, my mind completely blank. I kept waiting for it to come back out, for it to be a trick of the light, for it to be anything other than what I just saw. But it didn't. It was just gone. I stayed up in that tree stand for what felt like forever, but it was probably only an hour or so. But in that hour, my mind was racing. What the hell was that thing? A bear? No way. Bears don't walk like that. And not that big, not that human-like. Some kind of joke? Some guy in a costume, in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest road? At sunrise? Who would even do that? And even if it was, no costume I'd ever seen could make someone that tall, that massive, move like that, step over a fence like it was nothing. The more I thought about it, the more unreal it seemed, like I'd dreamt it or hallucinated it. But I knew what I saw. I knew it was real. And that scared the crap out of me. I finally climbed down from my stand, my legs shaky. I didn't feel like hunting anymore. I didn't feel like being in the woods at all anymore. I packed up my gear, fast, like I was being chased, and got the hell out of there. Didn't look back. I didn't hunt for weeks after that. Just the thought of going back into the woods, it made my stomach churn. I tried to rationalize it, tell myself it was just my imagination, or I'd seen a bear in a weird way or something. But deep down, I knew what I saw, and it was something else, something unknown, something big and powerful and unnatural. Years went by. I started hunting again, eventually. Time does that. It kind of smooths things over, makes the edges less sharp. But I never forgot what I saw. Never. It stayed in the back of my mind, this dark, unsettling thing that I couldn't explain away. Then, years later, around 2010 maybe, yeah, summer of 2010, I got into flathead catfish fishing. Different kind of thing from hunting, more relaxed, sitting by the water waiting for a bite. I'd go out with a buddy of mine, Mark. We'd go to Whispering Lake a lot. Big lake, covers almost 3,000 acres, lots of secluded coves and inlets. Perfect for catfish. We'd fish late into the night sometimes. Beach the boat, set up lawn chairs by the water's edge, couple of beers, fishing rods out, just waiting. Quiet nights mostly, just the sounds of the water lapping against the shore, crickets chirping, owls hooting in the distance. But sometimes we'd hear other things. From the woods around the lake, unsettling sounds, deep guttural sounds, like growls but deeper, different, and whoops. Loud, echoing whoops that would break the silence of the night and just hang there in the air. We'd hear them off and on different nights. At first, we were just kind of creeped out. We joked about it, said it was probably just wildlife, or maybe some kids messing around. But those sounds, they didn't sound like kids messing around. They sounded primal, ancient. We started talking about Bigfoot, you know, just joking at first. Maybe it's Bigfoot out there trying to steal our fish, we'd say. But the more we heard those sounds, the less we joked. We started looking into it a little, reading online, seeing if anyone else had reported anything around Whispering Lake. There were stories, of course, always stories, but you never really know what to believe online, right? Most of it seems like made-up stuff, people trying to scare each other, or just straight-up hoaxes. Bigfoot calls, they call them. Some people swear they're real, others say it's all BS, just owls or coyotes or something else making weird noises. We were on the fence, I guess. Part of us wanted to believe it was just some animal we couldn't identify. Part of us, the smaller, more uneasy part, wondered if maybe there was something else out there, especially after what I'd seen in the woods all those years ago. It was like this old, buried memory was starting to resurface, this nagging feeling that maybe there was more to the woods than we knew. Then it happened. That night. It was a hot summer night, no moon. Dark, but the stars were out. We were fishing in this secluded cove on the east side of the lake, really out of the way, surrounded by thick woods. We'd been there for a few hours, hadn't caught much, but we were just enjoying the peace and quiet. Around midnight, maybe a little later, it started. First, just the usual night sounds. Then we heard one of those deep guttural noises, off in the distance, somewhere in the woods behind us. We both went quiet, listened. Probably just an owl, Mark whispered. I nodded, but I wasn't so sure. It didn't sound like an owl. Then it happened again, closer this time, louder, and it wasn't just a growl anymore, it was more like a roar, but deeper, heavier, like something huge clearing its throat. We both froze. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Mark was staring into the woods, eyes wide. Okay, that's not an owl, he said, his voice shaky. And then the scream. It came from the woods, close, real close. It was deafening, like nothing I've ever heard before or since. It wasn't an animal scream. It wasn't a human scream. It was something else. Something in between, but way, way more terrifying than either. It was high-pitched but also deep and resonant, like it was coming from something enormous. It was full of pain and rage and something else. Something I couldn't name, but it chilled me to the bone. The scream just ripped through the night air and then silence. For a second, just complete silence. Then the chattering started. Right after the scream, from the same direction, just on the edge of the woods, we heard this rapid chattering sound. It was fast, clicking, like teeth chattering, but way too loud, way too fast. And it wasn't teeth chattering from cold. It was like language. That's the only way I can describe it. Like something was talking or communicating, but in this insane, rapid-fire chattering that didn't sound like any language I'd ever heard. Foreign, but not just foreign. Alien. Wrong. It went on for a few seconds, that chattering, then it stopped. Complete silence again, except for the sound of our own hearts pounding in our chests. We didn't say anything. We just stared at each other. Our faces were pale in the starlight. We both knew. Whatever that was, whatever made that scream and that chatter, it was in the woods, right there. And it was close. Without a word, Mark started scrambling, grabbing fishing rods, tackle box, everything, just throwing it into the boat. I was right behind him, doing the same. We didn't even think about being quiet. We just wanted to get out of there. Now. We shoved the boat off the shore, jumped in, and Mark yanked the starter cord. Engine sputtered, coughed, and finally roared to life. He threw it into gear and gunned it. We sped out of that cove, back into the main part of the lake, as fast as that little boat could go. We didn't slow down until we were halfway across the lake, the cove and the woods completely out of sight behind us. We finally cut the engine and just drifted for a minute, catching our breath, looking back at the dark shoreline, listening. Nothing. Just the quiet lapping of the water against the boat. We didn't say much that night driving home, just kind of numb. We were both shaken to the core, terrified. We knew that scream, that chattering. It was meant for us. It was a warning. Get out. You're not welcome here. That's what it felt like something was telling us to leave, to get out of its territory, and we'd better listen if we knew what was good for us. I haven't been back to Whispering Lake since. Neither has Mark. We still go fishing sometimes, but we find other places, other lakes. Places that don't have those woods right up to the water's edge. Places that feel safer. I don't know what that thing was. I don't know what I saw in the woods back in 1990. I don't know what made those sounds at Whispering Lake. I don't want to know, honestly. Part of me is still trying to tell myself it was just a weird animal, or a trick of the night, or my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I know. There's something else out there. Something big, something strong, something unknown, something that's been there all along, hidden in the woods, watching us, listening. And sometimes it lets you know it's there. And when it does, you better run. Because whatever it is, it's not friendly. And it's out there. Still. Story 6. All right, so I've never actually typed this all out before, not like this, not for, well, anyone really outside of, just talking about it here and there with my brother over the years. But seeing some of the stuff people post on forums, I figured maybe someone out there might get what I'm saying, or maybe just find it interesting, I don't know. It's been weighing on me for a long time, especially when I go back up there now. It's about the old family land up in Bealsville Heights, Monroe County, state of Eldoria. Sounds fancy, but it's just woods and hills, really. My dad passed a few years back, and me and my siblings, we own the old property now. It's about 300 acres, runs along Cats Run Road. There's the old farmhouse, falling apart mostly, and the barn's worse. But it's our land, So, I try to get up there now and then, keep it somewhat kept. Mostly just mowing around the house, stopping things from completely swallowing it whole. This was last summer. Scorcher. One of those days where the air just hangs on you, thick and heavy. I was out there with the mower, that old thing we used to use when we were kids. Loud as hell, but it gets the job done. Sun beating down, sweat running in rivers. I finally stopped for a minute, killed the engine, wiped my face with my shirt. Took a swig of water, warm as bath water already. That's when I heard it. Just a thud, like something heavy, hitting the ground nearby. I looked around, figuring maybe a branch fell out of one of the trees around the house. Nothing. Then another thud, a bit closer this time. I scanned the area, real slow, trying to see what it was. That's when I heard it a third time, and I saw it then. Just a normal goddamn rock bouncing a little as it hit the overgrown grass a few feet away from me. Rocks. It was always rocks. It started years ago, not always, but often enough when I was up there mowing. Random rocks just appearing, not falling from the sky or anything. They'd hit the ground or the roof of the house sometimes, always coming from the wooded hill that rises up behind the house and barn, always from that direction. Weird as hell. It wasn't just weird, it was unsettling. You get this feeling like someone's watching you, and not just someone, something. You can feel it in your gut. Like when you know you're being stared at from the dark, even when you can't see anything. That feeling. The rocks weren't constant, you know, just now and then, mostly when I was mowing, but they were enough to put you on edge, enough to make you glance up at that hill every few minutes, trying to see through the trees. But you never saw anything, just trees and shadows. It took me back, you know, back years and years ago, way back to when things started to feel wrong up there. It was deer season, December, must have been 75. I was young, maybe 17, 18, out hunting on the property like always. I'd gone deep into the woods, back up into those hills behind the farmhouse. Found a big cherry tree, figured it was a good spot to post up, blend in with the winter woods. Leaned back against the trunk, rifle across my lap. Cold out, but I was bundled up good. The woods were quiet, real quiet, like they get sometimes in the dead of winter. Too quiet almost. I remember the air was crisp, smelled like pine and damp earth. I remember watching the woods, waiting for a buck to step out. And then I drifted off. Just for a bit, you know. Warm sun coming through the trees, the quiet, the stillness. Next thing I know, I'm waking up and it's dark. Not pitch black, but that deep twilight you get right after sunset in the woods. Sun already gone, shadows long and heavy. Crap, I'd fallen asleep. And now it was getting late and I didn't have a flashlight with me. Dumb move. Panic hit me for a second. Not just because of the dark, but that sudden wake-up, you know how it is. Disoriented. I grabbed my rifle, stood up and started to head downhill, back towards the house. I knew the general direction, but in the dark, in those woods, everything looks different. It got darker fast. The woods closed in around me. I was trying to be quiet, you know, not crashing through the brush, but it's hard in the dark. Branches snapping under my boots, leaves rustling. My heart was starting to thump a little faster, not just from being lost, but something else. That feeling again, like eyes on you. I was trying to pick my way downhill when I stumbled, tripped over something. Felt like a log, maybe a fallen branch I hadn't seen in the gloom. I put my hand out to catch myself, and my hand landed on something warm and soft, like fur. I froze, felt my heart jump into my throat. Warm, in the middle of the woods in December, in the dark, and big. Whatever I'd tripped over was big. I was down on one knee, hand on this warm, furry thing, and for a split second my brain tried to tell me it was a deer bedded down. But deer don't feel like that. Then it moved, slowly at first, just a shifting weight, and then it started to rise. I scrambled back, stumbling backwards, fear exploding in my chest. This thing, whatever it was standing up, and it was big, towering over me. I could feel it, sense its mass, even in the dark. And it was warm, body heat radiating off it in the cold air. I couldn't see it clearly, not in that near darkness. But I could make out a shape, a dark shape against the slightly less dark woods. And it was tall. Too tall to be a deer, too upright. Then the smell hit me. Oh God, that smell. It was foul, like something rotting, like excrement, mixed with something else, something acrid and animalistic. It was thick, heavy in the air, suffocating. I gagged, instinctively pulling my shirt up over my nose, and then I felt it. The breath, hot, wet, and stinking, that awful stench just amplified in the hot breath. I felt it on my face, just inches away. I could almost feel the moisture of it. I knew somehow it was right there, leaning over me, close enough to touch. And I had touched it. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen, paralyzed with fear. I just crouched there, heart hammering, choking on the smell, feeling that hot, stinky breath wash over me in the cold night air. All I could think was, what the hell was this thing? Then, as quickly as it had happened, it was over. With another slow, lumbering movement, the shape started to turn. I heard it crashing softly through the underbrush, moving away, just lumbering like it wasn't even bothered by me, like I was nothing. And then it was gone. Just silence. And the smell, lingering in the air, thick and disgusting. I stayed there for what felt like forever, crouched on the ground, shaking, trying to breathe through my mouth to avoid that lingering stench. Finally, when I could move again, I stumbled to my feet, rifle clutched tight. I didn't run, I couldn't. I just walked, fast, but not running. Back the way I thought the house was. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. Convinced it was going to be there, right behind me, that warm, stinking mass. I made it back to the house eventually. Took me way longer than it should have. When I finally saw the faint glow of the porch light through the trees, I almost cried with relief. I burst through the door, shaking and pale. My parents were worried sick. I told them I'd gotten turned around in the dark. That's all I said. I didn't mention that thing. I told myself it was a bear. Yeah, a bear. Bears can stand on two legs sometimes, right? Maybe it was just a big bear standing up when I bumped into it. The smell? Maybe it had been eating something dead? Yeah, that's it. A bear. That's what it had to be. A bipedal bear. But even then, as a kid, I knew. Deep down, I knew it wasn't a bear. Bears don't smell like that. Bears don't move like that. Bears, they're not like that presence, that feeling. Years later, hunting with my brother Andy, same woods, must have been early 90s. We were in the hills again, separate spots, waiting for deer at dusk. Sun was going down, getting that same twilight feeling as before, the air cooling off. I remember feeling that little prickle of unease again, up in those woods, even after all those years. Dusk fell. Time to pack it in. I stood up from my spot, stretched my legs, and as I did, I heard it. Movement. Close by. Rustling leaves, snapping branches. Something else standing up nearby in the fading light. I thought it was Andy. Figured he was done hunting too, moving out. "Andy," I called out softly, keeping my voice low in case there were still deer around. No answer. Just the continued rustling, moving away through the trees. "Andy, come on, let's go," I called again, a little louder this time. Still nothing, just the sound of something moving fast, now, breaking branches, leaves flying, moving like it was running. "Andy, stop messing around," I yelled, annoyed now, figuring he was trying to be funny, sneak up on me or something. I started to move towards the sound, pushing through the brush, calling his name louder this time. "Andy, hey!" The sound of running just kept going, moving further and further away, faster and faster, unbelievably fast. Faster than Andy could run, that's for sure. Faster than anything I knew. It was moving like a phantom, just ripping through the woods, making incredible time, disappearing into the trees. Then I saw him. Andy. Standing up from his own spot, a little further down the hill, looking in my direction, confused. He hadn't moved. He hadn't been running. "What's up?" he called out, his voice carrying in the still evening air. "You yelling at me?" I just stared at him, the woods silent now except for the sound of our voices. Did you hear anything?" I asked. My voice quieter now, the annoyance replaced by something else, something colder. He shrugged. "Maybe a deer?" "What? You spooked something?" "No," I said. "No deer, something else. Something ran off, fast, real fast." He frowned. "Probably a bear. Yeah, gotta be a bear. They move quick." He said it like it was nothing, just a bear. End of story. Andy always rationalized things, made them fit into neat little boxes. Maybe it was a bear. Maybe. But that speed, that grace. It wasn't like any bear I'd ever seen. Or heard. It moved like nothing solid, just a blur through the trees. And that same feeling again, that prickling on the back of my neck, being watched, even though whatever it was had run away. Life went on. Years passed. I didn't go up to the old property much for a while after that. Bridge washed out on Cat's Run Road for a few years, made it a pain to get to. Then my truck started acting up, figured it was a sign. Just stayed away for a bit. But then, something pulled me back. That feeling, you know, those rocks. Started getting curious again. Curious and, yeah, a little scared, I guess. But curious more. What was throwing those rocks? Was it connected to that thing in the woods? Dumb questions, probably, but they stuck with me. So, I started going back up more often, mowing again, and the rocks started again too. Like clockwork, and that feeling of being watched, always there. Stronger now, somehow. Maybe because I was older, more aware. Maybe because I knew in the back of my mind that whatever was up there in those hills, it wasn't normal. Then there was the night with the thermal scope. My brother-in-law, Mark, he's got all sorts of gadgets, hunting gear. He'd heard me talking about the rocks, about the weirdness up at the property. He brought over this fancy thermal scope one night, said we should go up there, take a look. Curiosity got the better of me again. We went up after dark, parked down the road, hiked in, real quiet. Got up on the hill behind the farmhouse overlooking the yard. Total darkness. Just the woods and the night sounds. Mark set up the thermal scope, fiddling with the settings. "Okay, let's see if we can see any heat signatures," he whispered, handing me the scope. It was weird looking through it. Everything was in shades of grey and red, heat showing up bright red and orange. The house looked cold, grey. The trees, a little warmer but still mostly grey. Then I scanned towards the woods, further up the hill, and I saw it. Just a shape. Large, dark grey, almost black against the slightly warmer background of the trees, way up on the hill, deeper in the woods, too big to be a deer, too formless to be a tree or a rock outcropping, just a mass of coldness. And it was there, just there, not moving, not doing anything, just watching. I pointed the scope at it, zooming in as much as I could, still just a dark shape, no real details, just a presence, a large, cold presence up on that hill in the dark woods. And it was looking right back at us. I knew it. I could feel it, even through the scope. It was watching us. I held the scope steady, staring at that dark shape, feeling that ice in my gut again, that same primal fear from all those years ago when I was young in the ravine, smelling that stench, feeling that breath. It all came flooding back. "See anything?" Mark whispered, nudging me. I lowered the scope slowly, handed it back to him. My hand was shaking. "Yeah," I said, my voice quiet. "Yeah, I see something." He took the scope, looked through it. "Huh, big heat signature," he said matter-of-factly. "Probably a deer herd or something. Lots of deer up there." He always had an explanation too, like Andy, always rationalizing. "Maybe," I said, but I didn't believe it. I knew what I'd seen, and I knew it wasn't deer. It was that thing, or something like it. Something watching us from the darkness from the top of that hill, cold and silent and waiting. We didn't stay much longer after that. Just, that feeling was too much, too heavy. We packed up the scope, walked back down the hill, back to the car. I kept looking back, up at that dark hill, expecting to see, I don't know what. But I felt it, still watching us, even as we drove away. So, back to last summer. Mowing the lawn, rocks hitting the ground, the sun, the sweat, the sound of the mower, and that feeling, like eyes on me. I finished mowing the front yard, started on the side, closer to the woods, closer to that hill. The rocks started coming faster now, smaller ones mostly, but still rocks, hitting the roof, thudding on the ground, bouncing off the mower deck. I kept glancing up at the hill, squinting through the trees. Nothing, just shadows and leaves. But the rocks kept coming. It was like someone was getting angrier or impatient, like they wanted me to know they were there, like they wanted me to... What? Leave or something worse? I started to get really jumpy. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me flinch. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see that dark shape breaking through the trees, smelling that stench, feeling that breath. The mower sputtered, coughed, almost died. I fiddled with the choke, cursed under my breath, stupid old thing, and in that moment while I was messing with the engine, I heard it. Not a rock. Something bigger, a branch cracking close by, just at the edge of the woods, right at the base of the hill, louder than any branch snapping in the wind. A definite crack, like something heavy had stepped on it, or broken it. And then, silence. But a different kind of silence. A thick, heavy silence. Like everything else in the woods had gone quiet, listening. I froze, hands still on the mower's choke, staring at the edge of the woods. Heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the sweat go cold on my skin. That feeling intensified, like something was right there, just on the other side of the trees, watching me, waiting. I waited, holding my breath, listening. Nothing, just the silence, too quiet, too still. And then it stopped. Just stopped. The rocks, the feeling of being watched, even the silence somehow just lifted, like a switch had been flipped. Just gone. Everything went back to normal. The birds started chirping again. The breeze rustled the leaves. The heavy feeling in the air just disappeared. I stood there, staring at the woods, the mower sputtering quietly beside me, confused, shaken, wondering what the hell had just happened, wondering what was still up there, in those woods, on that hill. I finished mowing that day. Didn't see anything else, hear anything else, feel anything else, just nothing. Like it had all been in my head. But it wasn't. I know it wasn't. Those rocks, that feeling, that night in the woods, all those years ago. It's real. I know it's real. And I still can't explain it. Can't explain what threw those rocks, or what I bumped into in the dark, or what ran through the woods so fast, or what I saw through the thermal scope. I don't know what it is, or what it wants. I just know it's there, up on that hill, watching. And sometimes it lets me know it's there, with rocks, or with just that feeling. And then it stops, just stops, like it's satisfied, or bored, or something else I can't even imagine. It just stops and leaves me standing there wondering what the hell just happened, and still wondering what is up there in those woods. Story 7. It was supposed to be a relaxing Saturday, February, and that South Carolina air still had a bite, you know. Not freezing, but enough to make you want a jacket. Dale, my husband, bless his heart, he loves to fish. Me? I mostly go along for the quiet, the sunshine if we're lucky, and just being outside. We'd picked out our usual spot down by the Catawba River, just outside of Riverwood. Nothing fancy, just a place we could park the truck and walk down to the bank. We'd been there maybe an hour, just casting lines, not even getting much of a nibble, to be honest. It was peaceful, though. The river was moving pretty steadily, making that low, constant rushing sound, the kind that usually just makes you feel sleepy. The trees along the bank were mostly bare, winter still holding on, but you could see little hints of green starting to peek out, promise of spring coming. Then we decided to move. Dale thought maybe further downstream, closer to the old dam, might be a better spot. So we packed up our gear just a little bit because we hadn't gotten very settled and walked down the riverbank a little ways. We found another spot we liked, right where the bank got a bit steeper and the trees got thicker behind us, up on the slope. Set down our stuff again, rebaited the hooks, all that normal fishing stuff. And then it happened. Just this thwack. Loud, like something really heavy just hit the ground. Startled the heck out of both of us. We both jumped and looked around, not knowing what to expect. At first I thought maybe a branch fell out of a tree. But then I saw it. Right there, not even 5 feet from where we were standing. This rock, a good-sized rock, I mean, not a pebble, not something you'd kick around. This thing was solid, bigger than my fist, maybe 10, 12 inches across. I'm bad at guessing sizes, but it was hefty. We both stared at it, dumbfounded. Where did that come from? Dale picked it up, turning it over in his hands. That didn't just fall, he said, looking up at the embankment behind us. And he was right. It was sitting right there on the ground, like it had been dropped or thrown. We both looked up the hill. Now this wasn't just a gentle slope, it was steep, really steep. And thick with trees, vines, everything overgrown like crazy. You couldn't just walk up that thing easily, not without really trying. And even then, it would be loud. You'd be making a racket crashing through the brush. And that's when we heard it, rustling. Up there in the thick of it, high up on that slope, like something was moving around up there. But it wasn't like squirrels or deer. It was heavier, more deliberate, and higher up than any deer would be. It was up high, almost at the top of the embankment, moving through the trees. We both just froze, looking up, listening. My heart started beating faster, just that sudden jump of adrenaline when you know something's not right. "Someone messing with us?" I whispered, but even as I said it, I knew it didn't make sense. Who would climb up that crazy hill just to throw rocks at some fisherman? And without saying anything? It just felt off. Then we heard it. This sound. It started kind of soft, then got louder, and it sounded weirdly like an owl hoot. You know, that classic hoo-hoo-hoo sound. But it wasn't quite right. It was off-key, like someone trying to imitate an owl, but just failing miserably. It was deeper somehow and scratchier, less smooth than a real owl. And there was something unnatural about it, like it was forced. I looked at Dale, and he was looking at me, and we both knew it wasn't an owl. Not a real one, anyway. Something was making that sound on purpose. But what? And why? Then, right after that weird owl hoot, we heard another sound. This was different. It was sharp and quick and clacking, like someone was hitting 2 rocks together, or maybe branches. But it was fast, like clack, 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 in a little burst. And it also came from up there on the slope, from the same direction as the rustling and that messed-up owl sound. Now we were both seriously freaked out. This wasn't fun and games. This wasn't just some kids being stupid. This was weird, unsettlingly weird. And then it happened again. Another thwack. Another rock flying down out of nowhere and landing closer this time, maybe 10 feet from us. Not right on top of us, but definitely closer than the first one. And just like before, it was followed by more rustling from up the slope, then that same unnatural owl hoot, and then the clacking sounds. It was like a pattern. Rock, rustling, owl thing sound, clacking. Rock, rustling, owl thing sound, clacking. Over and over. It was deliberate. Whatever was up there was doing this on purpose. By this point, we were both totally creeped out. My hands were starting to sweat even though it was cold out, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Dale was looking around, his eyes wide, like he was trying to see through the trees, trying to figure out what was happening. "Dale," I said, my voice shaky, "I don't like this. Let's just go." He hesitated for a second, like he was thinking about it. He's not the kind of guy to run from anything, but I could see in his face that he was just as spooked as I was. "Yeah," he said finally, his voice low. "Yeah, let's go." We started packing up our gear, but our hands were shaking so badly it took forever to reel in the lines and pack up the tackle box. Every second felt like an eternity. Every rustle of leaves in the wind, every snap of a twig made us jump. We were both just waiting for another rock to come flying down, or that creepy owl sound again. Then it happened a third time. Thwack! Another rock. This time it landed even closer, maybe just feet away from our fishing rods. Way too close. and louder than the others too somehow. It felt aggressive. The rustling was louder this time, more frantic sounding, and the owl hoot was almost like a growl, deeper and angrier, if that makes sense. And the clacking was faster, more like a rattling now. Rattle, rattle, rattle. That was it. That was the point where we didn't just want to leave, we needed to leave. Panic started to set in. It felt like whatever was up there was getting closer, more insistent, and we had absolutely no idea what it was. Dale grabbed the flashlight out of our bag. He flicked it on and pointed it up the hill. The beam cut through the trees, but it didn't really penetrate that thick undergrowth. All we could see were tree trunks, branches, shadows jumping around. Nothing. Absolutely nothing that looked like a person or an animal or anything that could be making those sounds or throwing those rocks. Just trees and shadows and that steep, impossibly overgrown hillside. He moved the flashlight beam around, trying to catch something, anything up there, but still nothing. Just the trees, silent and dark, except for the rustling, which was still going on, and that breathing sound we hadn't noticed before. Faint, but there, underneath the rustling, like something was up there, watching us and breathing. We didn't waste any more time. We just grabbed what we could, rods, tackle box, chairs, everything in a rush, clumsy and fumbling. We practically ran back to the truck, didn't even bother to wind up the fishing lines properly, just yanked them in and threw them in the bag. Didn't care if we left anything behind, didn't care about anything except getting out of there. We scrambled up the riverbank, back to where we'd parked, tripping over roots and rocks in our haste. I kept looking back over my shoulder, expecting to see something, someone chasing us, or just standing there watching, but there was nothing. Just the trees, silent in the fading afternoon light. We piled into the truck, slammed the doors, and Dale fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so bad he could barely get them in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and he threw it in reverse, backing out of there as fast as he could. We didn't stop until we were back on the main road, driving away from Riverwood, driving away from the river, putting as much distance as possible between us and that hillside. We drove all the way home in silence. Neither of us said a word. What was there to say? We were both just processing, trying to make sense of what had happened. But there was no sense to be made. We got home, and it was still light out, but the afternoon was gone, wasted. We went inside, locked the doors, and just sat in the living room, not even turning on the TV, just sitting, staring at the wall, I guess. Later, we talked about it, tried to figure it out. Was it an animal? Some kind of weird bird we didn't know? But what animal throws rocks? And what bird makes a sound like that? Fake owl, scratchy and wrong? And those clacking sounds? It just didn't fit anything. Could it have been a person? Some kind of prankster like we first thought? But who would go to that much trouble, climbing up that crazy steep hill just to throw rocks at people they couldn't even see properly through the trees, and making those bizarre sounds? It just seemed too elaborate for a prank, and too creepy, and too focused, like whatever was doing it was actually trying to scare us, intentionally. We talked and talked, going over it again and again, trying to find some logical explanation, some way to make it make sense. But we couldn't. There was no logical explanation. There was nothing that could explain the rocks, the rustling, the sounds, the feeling of being watched from the woods. It just happened. To this day, we still don't know what it was. We haven't been back to that spot on the Catawba River. Honestly, we haven't been back to Riverwood at all. Just the thought of it still makes the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I know it sounds crazy telling this story. Even to myself sometimes, it feels like a weird dream. But it happened. It really happened. And I'll never forget the feeling of being down by that river on that cold February afternoon and hearing those sounds coming from the woods and knowing deep down that whatever was up there wasn't normal. It wasn't human. And it wasn't friendly. And sometimes late at night when it's really quiet, I still think I can hear that sound. That weird off-key owl hoot echoing in the darkness. And I shiver, even now, just remembering it. I have no explanation for it. And that's the part that really freaks me out. The not knowing, the mystery of it all. It's just out there. Whatever it was, it's still out there, somewhere in those woods, by that river. And that thought still chills me to the bone. Story 8. It was a Tuesday, I think. November something, 1982. Definitely November because it was cold, even inside the car, and the sun was going down way earlier than we were used to. Me and Sophie, my sister, we'd driven up to Hillsborough for some shopping. Nothing major, just, girl stuff. Clothes, mostly. Sophie was always way more into fashion than me, but I liked to tag along. It was an excuse to get out of Morrisville, honestly. Morrisville is quiet, like really quiet. Everybody knows everybody, and sometimes you just want to see something different. Hillsborough wasn't exactly New York City or anything, but it was bigger. More shops, more people, just more going on. We spent most of the afternoon wandering around, hitting a few department stores, a couple of those trendy boutiques that were just starting to pop up. I remember buying a sweater, kind of a thick cable knit thing, in a color I thought was called cranberry back then. Sophie found some boots she was practically drooling over. She had a real weakness for shoes, my sister. We ate at that diner, Miller's. The one with the checkered floors and those red vinyl booths. I had a cheeseburger and fries. Sophie got a salad, trying to be all healthy. We talked about the stuff we bought, about school, about this boy Sophie was maybe kinda sorta seeing. Just normal sister stuff. It was a good day, relaxed, fun. Nothing to hint at what was coming, By the time we were heading home, it was properly dark. We took Route 62 south like always, the way we knew like the back of our hands. Then, to get back to our place, you have to turn off onto Taylorsville Road. Route 62 is, it's a main road. Even in the evenings, there's usually some cars, headlights in the distance, that kind of thing. Taylorsville Road, though, that's a different story. Taylorsville Road is narrow, really narrow. It's mostly used by people who actually live out that way. Farmers, families tucked back in the woods. No streetlights out there. Just trees on both sides closing in on you, and the blackest dark you can imagine when there's no moon. That night, I don't think there was much of a moon. Or if there was, it was hidden behind clouds. We were still chatting in the car, laughing about something dumb that happened at the diner, probably. Radio was on low, some cheesy 80s song. Windows up, heater blowing, trying to keep warm in that old Ford Pinto we had. Sophie was driving. She usually did. She liked being in control, my sister, and I was just looking out the window, watching the trees blur by, thinking about, I don't even remember what, just normal thoughts. And then it happened. We were coming around this bend in the road, not a sharp bend, just a gentle curve, and suddenly, just bam! Sophie slammed on the brakes, hard. I lurched forward, seatbelt digging into my chest. My head snapped forward, and I think I might have even yelled a little. What the? Something like that, just instinct, and then I saw it, in the headlights, right there. Not even, I swear it wasn't even 2 feet from the hood of the car, just there, blocking the whole road. My breath just stopped, like someone had punched me in the stomach and knocked the air right out of me. My heart started hammering, so hard I could feel it pounding in my ears. Sophie was frozen too, just staring, hands gripping the steering wheel so tight her knuckles were white. It was tall. God, so tall. Taller than any man I'd ever seen, that's for sure. Taller than any thing I'd ever seen. I'm telling you, this thing was huge. I'm guessing now, thinking back, it had to be at least 7 feet, maybe more. 7.5? 8? I don't know. All I know is it towered over our car like a tree walking upright. It was shaped like a person, kind of. Upright, 2 legs, 2 arms. But wrong. Everything about it was just off. It was lean, but not in a skinny way. Like powerfully built, you know? Like muscles under fur. Yeah, fur, that's what it was. Covered in fur, thick, dense fur, reddish-brown, kind of shaggy-looking, 6, maybe 8 inches long, everywhere. Arms, legs, chest, back, even its face, or where its face should be. And the eyes. God, those eyes. That's what I remember most, I think. Those eyes. They were glowing, not like lit up from inside exactly, more like reflecting, red, a bright, unnatural red, like embers in a fire caught in the beam of our headlights. They were wide, just wide open, staring right at us. And I know this sounds crazy, but it looked surprised, like just as shocked to see us as we were to see it. Its whole posture was startled, frozen, just like us. It was standing there, smack dab in the middle of the road, this thing. And it looked just as terrified as we felt. I swear it did. Like we'd interrupted something. Time. It's funny how time stretches out in moments like that. They say your life flashes before your eyes, but it wasn't like that. It was more like everything slowed down. Each second felt like a minute, 5 seconds, maybe 10. I don't know. But it felt like a long, long time we just sat there staring at each other. Us trapped in the car, headlights blasting, and this creature, frozen in the road, eyes burning red in the dark. There was no sound, just silence. Except for maybe the engine of the car still idling, a low hum, no wind, no crickets, nothing, just silence, and those red eyes. And then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it moved. But not in a panicked way, not like it was running away or attacking or anything. It was calm, eerily calm. It just turned, slowly, deliberately, turned its back to the car and started walking, just walking, across the road. It walked on 2 legs, like a person, upright, but bigger, so much bigger. And its gait, it was human-like, yeah, in a way, but different, wider, more powerful. I remember seeing its arm swing as it walked, a huge arm, muscular, covered in that red-brown fur, swinging, almost casually, and it just kept walking, towards the side of the road, towards the trees, towards the fence. There was a fence along that stretch of Taylorsville Road, just a flimsy thing, you know, 4 feet high maybe, wooden posts, wire mesh, to keep cattle in probably. Nothing serious. And this thing, it just walked straight towards it, no hesitation, no slowing down. It just stepped over it, like it wasn't even there. One long stride, one leg lifted, cleared the fence completely, no problem at all. And then the other leg, and it was over, just gone, into the woods, just disappeared, as quickly as it had appeared, vanished, like it had never been there at all. Except, we knew it had been. We both knew. Sophie just sat there for a second, maybe 2, still gripping the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. Then she let out this breath, a long, shaky breath, like she'd been holding it in for forever, and she put the car in drive and just drove. Slowly at first, then faster still, like she wanted to get as far away from that spot as possible, as fast as she could. Neither of us said anything for a long time, not a word, just the sound of the car engine, the tires on the road, the radio still humming softly in the background. My heart was still pounding. I could feel it thumping against my ribs. My hands were shaking. I was cold, even with the heater blasting. Finally, after what felt like forever, Sophie spoke. Her voice was quiet, shaky. Did you see that? That's all she said. Did you see that? And I nodded. I couldn't speak. My throat felt tight, like it was closed up. Just nodded, and she nodded back. Like confirmation. Like we both needed to know we weren't crazy. That we'd both seen the same impossible thing. We drove the rest of the way home in silence. The house was quiet when we got in. Mom and Dad were already in bed, probably. We went straight to our rooms, didn't even talk to each other, just separated. like we needed to process it on our own. I lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, trying to make sense of it, trying to explain it to myself. But there was no explanation, none. It didn't make any sense. It was impossible. Creatures like that, they don't exist. They're in stories, in movies, not on Taylorsville Road. I replayed it over and over in my head. The headlights, the sudden braking, the thing in the road, those red eyes, the fur, the size, the calmness, the fence, the woods. Every detail was burned into my memory. I couldn't forget it if I tried, and I knew deep down that Sophie couldn't either. The next day, we didn't talk about it. Not really. It was like unspoken. A secret we shared but couldn't acknowledge. It was weird. Like the unspoken fear was bigger than actually talking about it. But eventually we started to talk. Just little bits at first, hesitant, asking each other if we really saw what we thought we saw, describing details to see if we remembered the same things, the red eyes, the fur, the height, the fence. We matched on everything. It was real, for both of us. So we told Mom and Dad. We tried to. Sitting at the dinner table a few days later, we brought it up, tentatively, like something kind of strange happened to us the other night. And they listened, politely, but you could see it in their eyes, disbelief, pity, maybe a little concern, like we'd both lost our minds at the same time. We told them about the road, the darkness, the creature in the headlights. We described it, the height, the fur, the red eyes. We told them how scared we were, and they just chuckled. Dad said something like, "Oh, girls, you probably just saw a deer in the headlights. They can look pretty big in the dark." Mom nodded and said, "Or maybe a bear. There are bears in the woods around here, you know." A deer? A bear? This thing was nothing like a deer or a bear. Nothing even close. But they just wouldn't believe us. They laughed it off, said we were letting our imaginations run wild, said we were tired, said it was just the dark playing tricks on our eyes. And after that, we just shut up. We knew they weren't going to believe us. We could see it. And honestly, it was embarrassing. Being laughed at, being dismissed like that, made us feel foolish, like we were making it up, even though we knew we weren't. So we stopped talking about it. To them, to anyone, it became our secret again. But this time, it was a heavier secret, a lonely secret. Because now, not only had we seen this impossible thing, but nobody believed us. We were alone with it. For years. I barely thought about it, tried to push it to the back of my mind, buried it deep down. Whenever Taylorsville Road came up in conversation, I'd change the subject. Whenever anyone mentioned weird animal sightings, I'd clam up. I just didn't want to relive it, didn't want to feel that disbelief again. But then, years later, decades actually, I was reading something online, just some local history website, I think, about Highland County, and I saw something, a comment, someone talking about sightings, strange sightings, back in the 80s, around Taylorsville Road. I clicked on it, read through the thread, and there it was, other people, talking about seeing things, big things, hairy things, things in the woods, things crossing the road, red eyes. Not everyone described the eyes as red, but the rest of it was similar. Too similar to be coincidence. People talking about things they'd seen, quick glimpses in headlights, shadows moving in the trees, things they couldn't explain, things they were afraid to talk about because nobody would believe them. And reading that, it was like a weight lifted, just a little. But still, validation, that's what it was. Other people had seen things too. We weren't crazy. We weren't alone. It had happened. It really had happened. I called Sophie that night, after all these years, and I told her about it, about what I'd found online, and she just listened, quietly. And when I finished, she said, "I knew it. I knew we weren't making it up." We talked for a long time that night, about Taylorsvale Road, about the creature, about the fear, about the disbelief, and it felt good to finally talk about it again, to finally feel like maybe we weren't completely crazy after all. I still don't know what it was we saw that night. I have no explanation. Bigfoot? Some kind of bear that walks upright? Something else? I don't know. And maybe I never will. But I know what I saw. And Sophie knows what she saw. And maybe some other people out there know too. People who have seen things in the dark woods of Highland County, on roads like Taylorsvale Road, and even now, all these years later, when I drive at night, especially on back roads, when my headlights cut through the darkness, I still get a little uneasy, a little chill. And I always check the side of the road, just in case those red eyes are staring back at me again, waiting in the dark. Story 9. It was probably around 4 in the afternoon, sun still high up, baking everything. We were cruising slow, windows down, just taking it all in. James was driving and I was looking out the passenger side, just scanning the fields and tree lines. That's when I saw it. At first, honestly, I just thought it was a big deer, out in this pasture. It was kind of reddish-brown color, standing maybe 100 yards off the road, out in the open. "Hey, James, hold up a sec," I said, pointing towards the field. He slowed the truck and pulled over to the side of the road in this little clearing. We both stared out across the pasture. The animal, whatever it was, had kind of dipped down into this little hollow, like a shallow valley in the field. Then, a second later, it popped back up, moving again, and that's when we both just froze. Because it wasn't a deer, not even close. This thing was huge, and it was walking upright, totally on 2 legs, striding across the field like it was just out for a casual stroll. I remember thinking, what the hell? My first thought was like some kind of weird bear, but bears don't move like that, not that gracefully, not with that kind of stride. It was tall, way taller than any bear I'd ever seen, even standing on its hind legs. I guessed maybe 8 feet tall at first. Just looking at it move, it seemed enormous. It was heading for the tree line at the edge of the pasture, still maybe a good 100 yards away, maybe a bit more. We just sat there in the truck, completely silent, watching it. Couldn't even speak. It was like our brains were short-circuiting, trying to make sense of what we were seeing, but nothing made sense. Then it got to this fence, a barbed wire fence, those 5-strand ones. You see them everywhere out there. And this thing, it just stepped right over it, like it wasn't even there, like it was just stepping over a curb. It didn't jump, didn't climb, just a long step, and it was over, no effort at all. That's when the reality of its size really started to hit me. That fence was at least 5 feet high, and it stepped over it without even a blink. It had to be way taller than 8 feet, easily. Later, we actually went back and checked, after everything, when we could even think straight again. We found this branch high up on a tree near where we saw it go into the woods, a branch it had clearly grabbed hold of. And measuring that, the height was closer to 9, maybe even 9.5 feet up, 9 feet tall, walking around like it was nothing. Anyway, so it gets over the fence, no problem, and keeps walking towards the woods. Then, right as it's stepping into the trees, it turns its head. And it looked right at us. I mean, right at the truck. It was like it had just noticed us for the first time. Maybe it had been too focused on where it was going before, or maybe it just didn't care. But it turned, and its eyes. I remember those eyes. Dark, kind of deep set, and they seemed intelligent. Like something was actually looking back at us. not just some animal on autopilot. It was only for a second, but then it hunkered down, still staring at us from the edge of the woods. And then it started moving again, but this time it was coming towards us, through the trees, heading back in our direction, towards the road where we were parked. It was moving stealthily now, quieter. We could see glimpses of it through the trees, flashes of that reddish-brown fur moving closer and closer. We just watched, frozen again. Every few seconds we'd catch another glimpse, further out of the woods, closer to the edge. It was slow, deliberate, like it was stalking us, but also like it was just curious. It kept disappearing behind trees, then reappearing a little closer. It was like in slow motion, but it felt like forever. We just sat there, hearts hammering, not saying a word, just watching this thing advance. Finally, it was right at the tree line, maybe 40 yards away. 40 yards. That's practically spitting distance. It stepped out fully into the open again, right at the edge of the woods, where the trees met the pasture, and it just stood there, staring right at us, both of us in the truck. I remember its face clearly, not really like a bear or an ape or anything I could put my finger on. More human-like, in a weird, messed-up way. It had a broad face, kind of flat nose, and these heavy brows, and the eyes, still dark and intense. And then I saw this thing on its upper lip, like a little split or a scar, a slight deformation right there on one side of its upper lip. It was just different, unusual, like a birthmark or something. And its expression, that's what really got to me. It wasn't angry. It wasn't threatening, not exactly. It was more concerned, almost questioning, like it was trying to figure us out, just as much as we were trying to figure it out. It was watching us, head slightly tilted, like it was thinking, "What are you two doing here?" I know it sounds crazy, projecting human emotions onto it, but that's genuinely what it felt like. Concern and curiosity, mixed with something else, something I couldn't name. Then it reached up and grabbed a tree branch that was hanging low over the edge of the woods. That's the branch we measured later. It just casually reached up and grabbed it, like it was just stretching or something. But standing there, seeing that massive hand, those long fingers, grabbing that branch, it was like something clicked in my brain. This wasn't just big. This wasn't just weird. This was dangerous. Fear, just pure, unadulterated terror just slammed into me. It hit me like a punch to the gut, and I saw it in James's eyes too. He was pale as a ghost, just staring, mouth slightly open, and I knew we had to get out of there now. "James, man, get us out of here," I yelled, and it came out way too loud, cracking my voice. He didn't need telling twice. He was already scrambling to get the truck in reverse. We were parked facing down Emery Road, thankfully, but there wasn't a lot of room to maneuver. We had to back up, maybe 100 feet or so, before we could even get turned around to drive forward. He slammed it into reverse, tires spitting gravel, and we started backing up fast as he could go, but it felt like slow motion. All the time, both of us were glued to the side mirror, watching that tree line, watching for that thing. We were half expecting it to come crashing out of the woods after us any second. I kept seeing it in my mind, those dark eyes, that concerned, questioning look, and then the size of it. 9 feet tall, easily, and we were sitting ducks in this old truck. We backed up what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. Finally, we got to a wider spot in the road where James could yank the wheel hard and turn the truck around. He did a 3-point turn right there on the road, engine roaring, tires screaming, gravel flying everywhere. And then we were pointed back the way we came, back towards anywhere but there. James floored it. We were bouncing all over the place, suspension groaning, but we just kept going, didn't look back once, didn't even breathe properly until we were miles away, back on the main highway. We didn't say a word the whole drive back to town, just sat there, both of us shaking. The sun started to go down as we drove, and everything felt darker, heavier. It was like the whole world had shifted, and we were in some different reality now. The reality where things like that, creatures like that, actually existed. We finally got back to James's place. We just sat in the truck for a minute, engine still running, staring straight ahead. Then James just turned off the key, real slow, like he was afraid of making too much noise. "What? What was that?" I finally managed to choke out. My voice sounded hollow, like it was coming from someone else. James just shook his head, eyes wide, still pale. He didn't say anything. He just opened his door, got out, and walked straight into his house. Didn't even say goodbye. Didn't look back. That was pretty much it. We never talked about it again. Not really. James just shut down. He became withdrawn, quiet, avoided me even. We used to be best buds, always together, hunting, fishing, just hanging out. After that day on Emery Road, it was like something inside him just broke. He wouldn't answer my calls, wouldn't reply to my messages. If I saw him around town, he'd just nod stiffly and walk the other way. It was like I was somehow tainted now, because I'd been there, because I'd seen it too. I tried to talk to him about it a couple of times, in the weeks that followed, just to try to make sense of it, to process it together. But he just wouldn't. He'd change the subject, or just walk away. It was like he'd decided to just erase it from his memory, pretend it never happened. Maybe that was his way of coping. I don't know. But we drifted apart, lost touch completely after a while, all because of that thing we saw out there. I didn't see anything like that again for years. Years. 8, 9 years. Something like that. I started to almost convince myself that maybe we'd imagined it. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, or we'd both been tired or something. Maybe our minds had played a trick on us. But deep down, I knew. I knew what I'd seen, what we'd both seen. Then it happened again. And this time was way worse, way closer, way more terrifying. It was October, I think, either 2011 or 2012. Definitely fall, getting colder. I live in Centerville now. Got a place out in the country. Got woods behind my house, good deer woods. My buddy Dwayne came over. He wanted to bow hunt. Never gotten a buck with a bow before, and he knew my property was good for deer. I told him, yeah, sure, come on out. I knew where the deer liked to bed down in the backwoods, pointed him in the right direction. He went out that afternoon, and he got one, a nice 8-pointer. He was stoked. First buck with a bow. We went out to where he'd dropped it, gutted it, the whole deal. It was getting late, starting to get dark. We didn't want to drag it all the way back to the house in the dark. It was a good 1.5 miles, maybe more, through the woods. So we decided to stash it. There's this big brush pile back in the field behind my house, near where Dwayne could drive his truck. We dragged the deer over there, shoved it behind the brush pile, hidden from coyotes, figured we'd get it in the morning. Dwayne was parked out in the field already, so we just needed to get his truck closer in the morning and load it up. We got back to the house. Dwayne was about to head home, but then he gets this call. His dad had been in a car accident. Nothing too serious, but he had to get to the hospital quick. Dwayne was all flustered, wanting to go. "I gotta go, man, I gotta go," he kept saying. I told him, "Dude, don't worry about the deer. I'll get it. You go take care of your dad. I'll drag it out in the morning." He was hesitant, but he was really worried about his dad. Finally, he agreed. Took off in his truck, and I was left with the deer out in the woods. I ate some dinner, chilled out for a bit. Figured I'd wait until it was a little later, let the woods quiet down. Plus, it was a cool night. Wouldn't hurt the deer too much being out there for a few more hours. It was after midnight when I finally headed back out. Moon was pretty bright, almost full, lighting up the field. I didn't even bother with a flashlight. Figured I could just use the moonlight. And honestly, I was feeling a little lazy. Didn't want to carry extra gear, just wanted to get the deer and get back to bed. So I went out unarmed, just planning to drag the deer back to the house. Walked out across the field towards the brush pile. Getting closer, I started hearing noises coming from behind the brush pile, rustling, snapping twigs, low grunting sounds. Coyotes, I figured. Probably already found the deer. Annoyed but not really worried. Just figured I'd have to scare them off and get the deer before they tore it up too bad. I hurried around the brush pile, and that's when I saw it. Again. It was right there, behind the brush pile, kneeling down, massive, even bigger than I remembered from the first time. It was the Bigfoot, right there, kneeling on one knee, right next to the deer carcass. It had the deer by a back leg, lifting it up, and it was peering into the deer's chest cavity where we'd gutted it, looking inside, like it was inspecting it. The sudden sight of it so close just shocked me to my core. It was like all the blood drained out of my face at once. My heart stopped. I froze, solid, just stood there staring, and it was staring back at me. It had looked up when I rounded the brush pile, and now its dark eyes were locked on mine. It stood up, slowly, rising up, towering over me. I'm 5'10", average height. When it stood up, its chest was literally above my head. I mean, I'm looking up at its chest. Its belly button was probably eye level for me. It was colossal, absolutely huge. It just stood there for a second, maybe two, just looking down at me. Then it did something. It swung its arm, its right arm, the one that wasn't holding the deer, swung it down hard and smashed the brush pile, just flattened it. Wood and branches snapping, flying everywhere. Boom, loud as anything. Sounded like a bomb going off in the quiet night. Then it stomped its foot on the ground. Hard again, thud. Another loud, jarring sound. It was like it was trying to intimidate me, scare me off. But I couldn't move. I was completely paralyzed. Just stood there, frozen, eyes locked on this giant creature. When I didn't run, when I didn't even flinch, it let out this sound, this guttural grunt, deep, rumbling, animalistic, but also like it had meaning behind it, like it was frustrated, impatient, grunt after grunt after grunt, a whole barrage of them, like it was saying, "Get out of here! Why aren't you running?" I could see its eyes in the moonlight, dark, deep, and intense. And I got this feeling, this overwhelming sense of impatience, like it was annoyed that I was still there, that I wasn't running away like any normal person would, and then the fear just broke me, completely overwhelmed me. My mind went blank, absolutely blank, and I just reacted. I grunted back, "Yeah, I know, sounds insane, but it's what happened." In that moment of absolute terror, my brain just shut down, and my only reaction was to grunt. Loud as I could, grunted right back at this 9-foot-tall monster, and it stopped, just stopped. Everything went silent. The grunting, the stomping, everything. It just stood there completely still, and I could see it in the moonlight. It tilted its head, slightly, just like it had done that first time years ago. Tilted its head and looked at me, confused, like it was actually shocked. It was like it couldn't believe what I'd just done, like it was thinking, did that little human just grunt back at me? It seemed genuinely surprised, puzzled. Then, slowly, deliberately, it dropped the deer carcass, just let it fall to the ground with a thud, and it started to walk away, back into the woods, grunting and snarling as it went, but not at me, more to itself, like it was muttering under its breath, angry, but also still confused. It stepped into the woods, and then all hell broke loose. It erupted, just went ballistic in the trees, crashing, smashing, twisting and breaking trees. The sounds were deafening, branches snapping, trunks cracking, trees falling. It was a full-on destructive rampage, like it was just unleashing all its frustration and anger on the woods. I just stood there, shaking. Then my legs gave out. I collapsed to my knees in the dirt, and just started to cry, silent sobs racking my body, relief washing over me in waves mixed with terror, exhaustion, and Disbelief. Thank God, thank God, thank God, I kept thinking, over and over, just repeating it in my head. Thank God it didn't kill me. Eventually the crashing and breaking in the woods stopped. Silence fell again, except for my ragged breathing and the pounding of my heart. I stayed there on my knees for a long time until my legs stopped shaking so bad. Then slowly I got to my feet. I was still terrified, but also determined. I wasn't going to leave that deer out there. I went over to the brush pile, or what was left of it, grabbed the deer by the legs and started dragging it, dragged it all the way back to the house. It took forever, felt like I was dragging a ton of bricks, but I did it. Got it back to the shed finally, collapsed on the porch, completely drained. It didn't really hit me until later, that night, when I was finally in bed, trying to sleep. That's when the nightmares started, reliving it over and over in my head, seeing its eyes, hearing those grunts, feeling that wave of terror, and the realization of how close I'd come to what? Death? Injury? I don't know. But it could have easily killed me. Easily. It was so much bigger, so much stronger. Why didn't it? Why did it just walk away? Why did it stop when I grunted? I still don't have any answers. To this day. It messes with you, you know? Makes you question everything. I still hunt, still go out in the woods, but never at night anymore, never after dark. And I always take my rifle now, just in case. The nightmares faded eventually, but the memory is still there, burned into my brain. And every now and then, when I'm out in the woods, especially if it gets quiet, real quiet, I still get that feeling, that prickle on the back of my neck, that sense that something's watching, something big, something unknown. And I know, deep down, it could still be out there, somewhere in the woods, just watching. Story 10. It was supposed to be a normal night, just fishing like I'd done 1,000,000 times before. I fish alone a lot. It's my way to unwind, get some peace after a long week at the plant. This was back in, well, it was a while ago now, but I remember it was a Friday night. I'd been looking forward to it all week. Packed my usual gear, grabbed a 6-pack of Mountain Dew, yeah, I know, not beer, judge me, and headed out to the spillway. The sun was starting to dip when I got there, that orangey glow you get just before it's properly dark. There was nobody else around, which I didn't mind. Usually, even on a Friday, you'd get a couple of other guys fishing, especially near the spillway. Good spot for catfish, or so I always thought. But nope, nobody but me. Felt kinda isolated, but not in a bad way at first. Just quiet. Parked my truck up top right by those old trash barrels they have there, the big metal ones. Grabbed my stuff, tackle box, rods, the dew, and walked down to the spillway. The air felt different that night. Thick maybe, heavy like before a storm, but the sky was clear. No clouds, just starting to turn that deep blue-purple as the light faded. Set myself up downstream from the spillway itself, right where the water kind of levels out and starts moving slower. Threw out a couple of lines, put some night crawlers on the hooks. Nothing fancy, just wanting to relax. Maybe catch something, maybe not. Didn't really matter that night, to be honest. Just being outside by the water was enough. Brought my little radio with me, a cheap thing that runs on batteries. Flipped it on, found some classic rock station playing, low volume, just background noise. Started casting and reeling, mostly just going through the motions. Wasn't really focused on the fishing at first. Just kind of zoning out, you know. Looking at the water, listening to the radio, just letting my mind drift. The spillway itself, it's imposing in the dark, even with those lights they have there, the yellowish ones that cast everything in this weird glow. It still looks kind of off. Big concrete thing, water rushing over it, always making that roar. It's not a natural sound, you know? Mechanical, almost angry. And I'm telling you, that night it sounded louder than usual. Or maybe I was just more aware of it because it was so quiet otherwise. I was just getting comfortable, maybe half an hour in, the sun properly gone now, full dark, when I started hearing other noises. At first, I didn't really pay attention. You hear all kinds of things out in the woods, especially by the water. Branches breaking, animals moving around, wind rustling in the trees. Normal stuff. But these noises, they weren't normal. They were louder, more distinct than just rustling leaves. It was like something was moving around in the woods up above the spillway, on top of the dam part. Heavy stuff, like something big. I figured maybe deer. Sometimes you see deer around there, though deer don't usually sound that heavy. The sounds kept getting louder and weirder, like snapping branches, but mixed with something else. A kind of thumping. Heavy thumps, like something big landing hard on the ground. And a weird kind of shuffling sound, like dragging something. It started to make me a little uneasy, honestly. Just a little prickle of something not right. I turned the radio up a bit, trying to drown out the noises, tell myself it was just animals. But the noises just got louder. They started to sound closer, closer to the top of the dam, right above me. That's when I first heard the screaming. It wasn't human screaming, not like anything I'd ever heard before, more animalistic, but not like any animal I knew either. It was high-pitched, screeching almost, like a monkey maybe, but amplified, way louder and more aggressive, angry. That's the best way to describe it, angry screams. I froze, fishing rod in my hand, radio still playing that rock song, but suddenly I couldn't hear it anymore over the screaming. My heart started hammering in my chest. Adrenaline kicked in, that cold rush of fear that just grabs you and squeezes. I spun around, looking up towards the top of the dam. My eyes were struggling to adjust in the dim light from those yellow lamps. And then I saw them, 2 of them, right up there on top of the dam, under one of those lights. Dark shapes, silhouetted against the sky, moving around erratically. They were big, huge, taller than any man I'd ever seen. Definitely not deer. They were hairy. That's the first thing that hit me, covered in dark hair, like apes, but way bigger. And they were standing upright, sort of. They'd hunch over sometimes, then stand up straight again. Moving around, back and forth, pacing, jumping, waving their arms around like they were angry or agitated or trying to get my attention. And they were still screaming, that horrible screeching noise. It was coming from them. One of them, or both, I couldn't tell. It was echoing off the concrete, bouncing around, making it even louder, more terrifying. It felt like it was drilling right into my skull. They weren't just screaming, they were making other noises too, growling almost, deep, guttural growls that vibrated in my chest, and these weird, high-pitched, chirping sounds, like birds but distorted wrong. It was a whole cacophony of insane noises, all mixed together. The screaming, the screeching, the growling, the chirping, and the heavy thumping and shuffling I'd heard before. I just stood there, frozen, staring up at them, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My brain just wouldn't process it. It felt like a nightmare, like my eyes were playing tricks on me. But I knew I was seeing something real, something impossible. They kept moving around, pacing back and forth at the edge of the dam, looking down towards me. Sometimes they'd jump up and down, these heavy, earth-shaking thumps. Sometimes they'd wave their arms, these long, dark arms with hands or paws. I couldn't really tell in the dim light. They just looked huge and dark and hairy, like monsters. They didn't look like bears or anything natural. They looked primitive, ape-like, but bigger, stronger, more terrifying, like something out of a horror movie. But this wasn't a movie. This was real. This was happening right in front of me, the one on the left. It stepped closer to the edge of the dam, right under the light. I could see it better then. Not clearly, but better. It was massive. 8, maybe 9 feet tall easily, covered head to toe in thick, matted, dark brown hair. Its face, I couldn't really make out details of its face in the shadows, but I saw a flat nose, I think, a wide mouth, and eyes. I saw the glint of eyes in the light, dark, intelligent eyes, and they were looking right at me. It let out another scream, this ear-splitting shriek that went right through me. Then it banged its chest with its fist, this loud, booming thud. Like a drum, bang, 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 chest beating, screaming, screeching, pacing, waving its arms. It was like a nightmare come to life. The other one, it was moving around behind the first one. I saw glimpses of it too, just as big, just as hairy. They were both behaving the same way, erratic, aggressive, screaming, not like they were attacking me exactly, but threatening, intimidating, like they were trying to scare me, push me away. And it was working. Oh God, was it working? Fear, pure, raw, gut-wrenching fear. That's all I felt. I didn't understand what I was seeing. I didn't understand why they were behaving like this. I just knew I was terrified. Utterly, completely terrified. I'd never felt fear like that before in my life, and I pray to God I never feel it again. My mind went blank. Instinct took over. Survival instinct. Get out. Get away. Now. That's all I could think. I didn't care about my fishing rods, my tackle box, anything. I didn't even think about my due. I just ran. I dropped my rod, just let it fall into the water, turned and bolted, back up the path towards the parking lot. Heart pounding, legs burning, lungs screaming for air. I didn't look back. I didn't dare to look back. I just ran as fast as I could. I could still hear them. Even as I ran, I could still hear those awful screams echoing behind me, and the thumping, still pounding on the ground. It felt like they were following me, or maybe just pacing, still on top of the dam. I didn't know, and I didn't want to find out. Made it back to the parking lot. My truck was there, just sitting there in the darkness. Fumbled with my keys, hands shaking so bad I could barely get them in the lock. Got the door open, jumped inside, slammed it shut, locked it again even though it was already locked. Started the engine. Tires spun as I threw it in reverse and backed out of there. Didn't even bother to turn around properly, just screeched out of the parking lot and onto the road. Drove like a maniac, way too fast, back towards town. Didn't slow down until I was miles away from that spillway. Didn't stop until I was back in my driveway, parked in my own garage door down, safe inside my house. I sat there in my truck for a long time after I got home, just shaking, heart still racing, sweat pouring down my face even though it was a cool night. I couldn't breathe properly. It felt like I'd just run a marathon, but worse, much worse. Eventually I got out of the truck and went inside, walked straight to the shower, clothes and all, and just stood there under the hot water until it ran cold. Trying to wash away the fear, wash away what I'd seen, but it didn't work. The fear, it's still there. It's still inside me. I haven't been back to Wills Creek Dam spillway since that night. Not even during the day. I can't bring myself to go back there. Just thinking about it, about those things, those creatures, it makes my skin crawl. I have nightmares sometimes, dreams of screaming, dark shapes in the shadows, eyes glinting in the light. I've tried to tell people about it, tried to explain what I saw, but nobody believes me. They just laugh, call me crazy, say I was drinking or hallucinating or just spooked by shadows. They say there's no such thing as what I saw, but I know what I saw, I know what I heard, and I know I'll never forget it. Those screaming things on top of that dam, looking down at me, watching me, trying to scare me away, or something else. I don't know what they wanted, I don't know what they were, and I don't want to know. All I know is that they were real, and they were terrifying, and sometimes late at night when it's quiet, I still hear those screams in my head. Just a faint echo, but it's there, and it reminds me of what's out there in the dark. Things we don't understand, things we can't explain, things that are real, even if nobody else believes it, especially when nobody else believes it, because I was there and I saw them, and that's a memory I'm stuck with for life. Story 11. I've been hunting coon since I was barely old enough to hold a rifle steady. Been in those woods around Athens County more times than I can count. Wayne National Forest, specifically Utah Ridge. That's my backyard, pretty much. I know those trees. I know the way the wind sounds when it's pushing through the pines. I know the creaks, the dips, and every little sound a deer makes rustling in the leaves. I'm comfortable there, or, well, was comfortable. I think it was late October. Crisp night, stars sharp in the sky, the kind of night that's perfect for a hunt. Me, Billy and Marcus, we packed up the dogs and headed out to Utah Ridge like we always did. We had Duke and Belle, seasoned hounds, best in the county. Those dogs, they've treed more coons than anyone I know. They ain't skittish, not afraid of anything you'd normally find in those woods. Raccoons, possums, even bobcats they just handle. It's in their blood. We parked up near the edge of the forest, unloaded the dogs, and let them get to sniffing around. Usually Duke and Belle are raring to go, pulling on the leashes, noses down, tongues lolling, eager for a scent. But that night, something was off right from the start. They were hesitant, pulling back, tails tucked a little. I figured maybe they were just being lazy. It had been a long day for them too. Maybe they were just tired. "Come on now, you old lazy bones," I said to Duke, giving his leash a little tug. "Let's get going." He whined, a low, uneasy whine, not the excited bark he usually gave. Belle was doing the same thing, sticking close to Billy's leg, not wanting to venture into the trees. We had to practically drag them to get them moving. As we went deeper in, it just got worse. They kept slowing down, sniffing the ground nervously, ears perked, but not in the way they do when they're tracking. This was different. This was like fear. I remember saying to Billy, "What in the world is wrong with these dogs? They acting like they've seen a ghost." Billy shrugged. "Maybe they picked up the scent of a bear or something?" Bears aren't common in that part of Wayne, but they're around sometimes. But even bears don't spook these hounds like this. They'd usually be curious, maybe a little cautious, but never outright terrified. We pushed on anyway, thinking they'd snap out of it once they caught a proper coon scent. We were headed towards this clear-cut area. I knew it was coming up ahead. Big open space where they logged out a section a few years back. Figured maybe there'd be good coon hunting there, with the new growth coming in. We reached the edge of the clear-cut, and that's when things went from just weird to something else entirely. The dogs completely froze, just stopped dead in their tracks, like hitting a brick wall. They weren't whining anymore, not even moving. They were statues, every muscle tense, staring straight ahead into the darkness of the clear-cut. "Duke? Belle?" I called out, my voice a little louder than I meant it to be. Still nothing from them, just these frozen, terrified stares. We pulled at their leashes, tried to coax them forward, but they wouldn't budge. It was like they were physically paralyzed by something. Then we heard it. A sound coming from the clear-cut. Heavy breathing, like someone struggling to catch their breath, but deep, really deep, like it was coming from a massive chest. "Hear that?" Marcus whispered, his voice tight. Billy and I both nodded, our eyes wide. At first, the sound seemed like it was coming from about head height, maybe 6 feet off the ground, like someone tall standing in the trees. But as we stood there, listening, trying to figure out what the hell it was, the sound started to change. It got louder, deeper, and higher. It sounded like whatever was breathing was rising up, getting taller. Foot by foot, the breathing seemed to be coming from higher and higher in the air. By now, the dogs were beyond just being scared. They were whimpering, low, pathetic whimpers, sounds I'd never heard them make before. Duke actually laid down on the ground, belly flat, shivering. And Belle did something that really shocked me. She peed. Right there on the leaves, just completely lost control of herself, pure terror. These are trained hunting dogs. They never do that, especially not Belle. She's the toughest of the two. The breathing sound was still getting higher. It was way above our heads now, maybe 8, 9 feet in the air, and it was heavy, labored like whatever it was enormous and struggling. It didn't sound human. Not like any animal I knew either. It was alien. We were all rooted to the spot, flashlights cutting through the darkness of the clear-cut, but we couldn't see anything. Just the black silhouettes of the newly grown trees against the starlight, branches reaching up like skeletal fingers. And that breathing, just that terrifying, heavy breathing, getting louder and higher. My heart was pounding in my chest. Adrenaline surged through me, but it wasn't the usual excitement of the hunt. This was pure, cold fear, the kind that makes your stomach clench and your throat go dry. I've been in tense situations before, been startled by animals, even had a close call with a buck once, but this was different. This was like something primal, something ancient and terrifying had woken up in these woods. "We gotta get out of here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Marcus and Billy didn't argue. They were just as pale as I was, eyes locked on the dark expanse of the clear-cut. Slowly, carefully, we started to back away, pulling the dogs with us. They didn't resist now. They were desperate to get away, scrambling backwards, still whimpering. As we backed away, the breathing sound. It didn't stop. It didn't fade. It just stayed there, heavy and close, seeming to move with us. It was like whatever was breathing was following us, still unseen, still in the darkness of the clear-cut, but definitely following us. We picked up the pace, moving faster, almost running backwards now, tripping over roots and fallen branches in our panic. The breathing kept pace with us. We'd move fast. It'd move fast. We'd slow down. It'd slow down. It was always there, just behind the tree line, just out of sight, that heavy, awful breathing, pushing us, driving us. I kept turning my flashlight back towards the clear-cut, sweeping it across the trees, desperate to see something, anything that was making that sound. But there was nothing. Just trees, shadows, darkness, and that damn breathing. It was like it was invisible, a presence without form, just a sound of immense, unseen lungs working in the blackness. We stumbled back to the edge of the woods, to where we'd parked the truck, not stopping until we were right back at the road. We practically threw the dogs into the truck bed, scrambled into the cab, and I jammed the key into the ignition, hands shaking so bad I almost missed it. I slammed the gas pedal and we roared out of there, tires spitting gravel, not stopping until we were miles away from Utah Ridge, back on the main highway. We didn't say much in the truck, just heavy breathing of our own, the kind that comes after running for your life. When we finally stopped at a gas station down the road, we just sat there for a while, staring out at the brightly lit parking lot, trying to catch our breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The dogs were still trembling in the back of the truck, quiet now, but you could feel the residue of their terror. What the hell was that?" Marcus finally croaked, running a hand over his face. Billy just shook his head, his eyes still wide and haunted. I didn't have an answer either. I've hunted these woods my whole life, and I've never heard anything like that. Never felt fear like that. "It was big," I said finally, my voice still shaky. "Whatever it was huge, and it followed us. It was deliberate." We sat there in silence for a long time. We talked about bears, mountain lions, wild dogs, every animal we could think of that might make a breathing sound, but nothing fit. Nothing explained the height of the sound, the sheer terror of the dogs, the way it followed us, unseen, pushing us out of the woods. We haven't been back to Utah Ridge since, not for hunting, not for anything. The dogs still get skittish if we even drive in that general direction. They remember, they definitely remember, and so do I. Sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I still hear it, not out loud, but in my head. That heavy, labored breathing in the dark. And I get that cold feeling again, the one that settles deep in your bones. I try to tell myself it was just something, an animal, maybe a trick of the woods, sound playing tricks in the still night air. But deep down, I know it wasn't. Deep down, I know we heard something that shouldn't be there, something ancient and vast and hungry. And I still can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, in those woods, still breathing, still watching, waiting in the darkness of Utah Ridge. And I pray to God we never hear it again. Story 12. Anyways, my name's Jerry. Used to be a diesel mechanic. Used to be, being the key phrase. Back went out last spring. Surgery screwed me up more than fixed me. Then the shop let me go. Just like that. 44 years old and suddenly, nothing. Then Mom passed. Just piled on. One thing after another. Sold her place to cover some debts and, well, here I am. Or was, back then, living in a beat-up old camper. Not exactly where I pictured myself at this age, you know. Found this spot down by the Kokosing River on John Norris's land. He owns the claim. Let me park my camper there. Figured I could do some odd jobs for him, keep myself busy. John's all right. Member of the Prospectors Association like me. Always been into panning for gold, even just as a hobby. So, down by the river, figured I'd at least try and find some of that flower gold they talk about. Something to do, something to keep my hands busy. And yeah, it was kind of peaceful, you know. Quiet. Too quiet sometimes. Summer was rough. Lost my beagle Tug in July. Old age, mostly. Broke my heart, that dog. Been with me since he was a pup. Evenings got real lonely after that. Just me, the river, and the trees. This particular night. Man, I remember every little thing about that day now. Even the stuff I didn't think twice about then. Like it's burned into my brain. Worked for a couple moving out to New Mexico that day. Hauling scraps of wood for them, old furniture, junk they didn't want to take. Pay was cash, which was good, needed every penny. Didn't get back to my camper till late, must have been close to 10. Felt beat, back was aching something fierce, but still, I was restless. Couldn't just crawl into that little coffin and stare at the ceiling. So I figured, fire. Always liked a good fire. Relaxing. Built one in the pit outside my camper, got it roaring pretty good. Opened a beer, just one, Coors Light, nothing fancy, and sat down in my folding chair. Just watched the flames jump, listened to the river gurgling past. It was almost nice. For a minute there, almost forgot all the crap piling up. Must have been around 1 in the morning, maybe a bit later. Fire was still burning strong, throwing good heat. I'd just tossed on another log. That's when I heard it. Crack. Loud as hell, like a gunshot in the quiet. Sounded like a tree cracking, snapping right across the river. Didn't think too much of it, figured it was just an old branch finally giving way, you know? Trees do that. But then came the splash. Not like a branch falling in. This was big, like something heavy went into the water. A real deep splash. My gut clenched up a little, just a twitch at first. Figured maybe a deer, maybe a buck crossing the river. Seen them do that before. Grabbed my flashlight, bright LED thing, pretty powerful. Kept it for emergencies, you know, out in the woods and all. Clicked it on, beam cut through the dark. Aimed it across the riverbank, just to see what it was. Expected to see eyes reflecting back, maybe a flash of brown fur. But nothing at first. Just trees, the opposite bank, water glinting in the light. Then I moved the beam down, towards the shallows near the edge of the water, and that's when I saw it. Jesus Christ, I don't know how else to describe it. Leviathan. That's the word that comes to mind now, like something out of a nightmare. It was standing in the river, maybe knee-deep in the shallows, just standing there. Dark. Darker than the shadows, if that makes sense. Like it was swallowing the light itself. Huge, I mean massive. Taller than any man, wider too. Couldn't really make out details at first, just this bulk of darkness against the lighter water. And then, the eyes. They caught the flashlight beam. 2 points of red, glowing like hot coals. Burning red marbles, stuck in that darkness. They stared right at me, didn't blink, didn't move, just burned. My breath hitched. I froze, stuck there, beam of light locked on those red eyes, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It took, I don't know, felt like forever, but probably just seconds. Seconds that stretched out into years of terror. It took a step, forward, out of the deeper water, towards the bank. and as it moved, more of it came into the light. The shape, it was vaguely human, but all wrong, distorted. The arms, God, the arms were long, way too long, hanging down past its knees even in the water, thick too, like tree trunks, and dark, so dark. It stopped again, mid-stride, 1 foot in the water, one just coming up onto the bank, and it turned its head, slowly, those red eyes fixed on me, still burning, and that's when it screamed. Not a roar, not a growl, a scream, high-pitched, ear-splitting, deafening. It ripped through the night, echoing off the trees, bouncing back from the river, like nails on a chalkboard, but 1,000 times worse. Painful, physically painful to hear. It went right through me, shook me to my core, and in that scream, I saw its mouth open, wide, so wide, and I saw teeth, not animal teeth, not fangs or claws, teeth like human teeth, but huge, big, square, almost yellowed, and too many of them, packed in that gaping maw. That was it. That was the snap. Something broke in my brain right then. Pure, unfiltered terror. Every instinct, every cell in my body screamed one thing: run. Dropped the flashlight, didn't even think about it, just spun around and ran, full-out sprint, towards the camper, like my life depended on it. Because it did. I knew in that moment, I knew with a certainty that went deeper than any thought, that if that thing got to me, that was it. Game over. Heart hammering in my chest, lungs burning, legs pumping. Didn't look back, didn't dare to, just ran. Stumbled in the dark, roots, rocks, didn't matter, just kept going. Fumbling for the camper door, keys shaking in my hand. Got the lock open somehow, threw the door open and dove inside. Hit the floor hard, felt a sharp crack on the side of my head, right above my eye. Everything went blurry for a second. Pain shot through my forehead. But adrenaline was screaming louder. Scrambled to my feet, slammed the camper door shut, fumbled with the deadbolt, got it locked. Flipped the little latch thing on the handle, just anything to make it harder to open. Like that flimsy door would stop anything that big, anything that screamed like that. Blinds. Remembered the blinds, fumbled with them, pulled them down, trying to shut out the night, shut out it. Then the shotgun. Kept it under the bed for critters, mostly. Raccoons, maybe coyotes. Never thought I'd be using it for that. Pulled it out, fumbled with the shells, deer slugs, loaded it, chambered around, sound of the pump echoing in the small space. Felt a little better, having it in my hands, cold metal against my sweaty palms. Sat there, back against the door, shotgun across my lap, listening. Every nerve in my body screaming, waiting for the camper to rock, for the door to splinter, for it to come crashing in. Silence, just the river still gurgling outside, wind in the trees, my own ragged breathing, nothing else. No screams, no heavy footsteps, no anything, just silence, except for the pounding in my ears. Sat there for, I don't know how long, minutes, hours. Time stopped meaning anything, just darkness, silence, and the burning image of those red eyes, those teeth, the scream still ringing in my head. Exhaustion finally started to creep in, the beer from earlier, the late hour, the sheer terror. It all started to pull me down, started to feel heavy, eyes getting droopy. Fought it, tried to stay awake, but it was like fighting the tide. Next thing I knew, sunlight. Blinding sunlight through the crack in the blinds, confused, disoriented, head throbbing, felt something wet and sticky on my face. Reached up, touched my forehead, came away with blood on my fingers, gash above my eye. Must have cracked my head good when I dove into the camper, shotgun still in my lap, cold, heavy, felt stiff, achy all over. Slowly, carefully put the safety on the shotgun, set it aside, listened. Still silence outside, just birds chirping, morning sounds, heart still pounding, but slower now, more like a dull ache. Slowly got up, peeked through the blinds. Outside looked normal, sun shining, trees swaying, river flowing, just normal, like nothing had happened. But it had. I knew it had. It wasn't a dream. I felt the cut on my head, saw the blood, heard that scream, saw those eyes. It was real. Carefully unlocked the door, unlatched it slowly, quietly, pushed it open. Shotgun in hand, pointed out in front of me, stepped out. Campsite, empty. Camper still standing upright. Fire pit. Just embers now, glowing faintly in the morning light. Folding chair still sitting there like I left it. Everything normal. Too normal. Scanned around. Trees, riverbank, across the river. Nothing. No sign of it. Just woods. Empty woods. Like it had all been a hallucination. Relief flooded through me, mixed with something else. Unease. It was gone, yeah, but where did it go? What was it, and why was it gone? Started to look around a bit more, just to make sure. That's when I noticed things were off. Subtly, but off. My beer. The Coors Light I'd opened last night, barely touched. Gone. Just gone. The empty can was there in the fire pit, crushed flat like I always do. But the full one vanished, like it had just evaporated. And then the water jugs. I always kept a couple of empty gallon jugs on the picnic table, ready to refill at the spring up the road. They weren't on the table anymore. They were on the ground, near the fire pit, lying on their sides, empty. Okay, maybe they fell. Wind, something knocked them over. But then I looked closer. They weren't just lying on the ground. They were arranged, lying side by side, openings facing each other, perfectly aligned, like someone had placed them there, deliberately. But why? And who? Or what? Goosebumps prickled up my arms, even in the morning sun. That unease turned into something colder. Dread. It was gone, yeah, the creature, whatever the hell it was, but it had been here, right here, and it had taken my beer and played with my water jugs. Made no sense. None of it. Still doesn't. Packed up my stuff that day, told John Norris I had to leave, family emergency, something like that. Didn't tell him about this. Who would believe me? Sounded insane even to my own ears. Drove away from that place. Haven't been back since. Don't think I ever will. Campfire nights. Yeah, they're different now. Can't even look at a campfire the same way. See the flames jump, smell the wood smoke, hear the crackle, and all I can think of is those red eyes, that scream, and those water jugs lying on the ground, openings facing each other. Still got no idea what it was. Don't want to know, maybe, just glad I'm alive, and still wondering about that beer and those jugs. Just wondering and trying to forget. But you don't forget something like that. You just live with it and try not to listen too closely to the sounds of the night, especially down by the river. Story 13. It's still messed up thinking about it. Even now, years later, just bringing it up gets my heart going a little faster, you know? Like I can feel that cold, prickly feeling creep up my back again. It wasn't something you just shake off, not something you forget. People talk about spooky stuff online all the time, and I guess I used to read it and think, yeah, sure. But then something like this happens to you and you realize there's things out there, things you can't explain away with logic or reason. We were out prospecting for gold, me and Ron, my partner. We'd heard good things about Knox County, Eldoria, figured we'd give it a shot. Ended up down by the Kokosing River. It's a pretty spot, quiet usually. We weren't totally alone. There were other folks camped up by the hiking trail, maybe 50 yards back from the riverbank. But right there by the water, just us, which we liked. Peace and quiet, you know. That's the point of getting out there, right? We'd parked our camper in this spot because it was right on the edge of the river, easy access. It was the same spot Jerry Klein had been in, we found out later. He'd already packed up and left by the time we got there. We talked to some of the other campers. They said he'd spooked himself something awful. They told us he was hearing stuff, making Bigfoot calls into the woods and getting answers back. Wood knocks, they said, late at night. Even heard pounding on this old rusted-out stove someone had dumped in the trees nearby. Honestly, at first, we just chuckled. Jerry seemed like the type to get worked up over nothing. No offense to the guy if he ever reads this. We figured probably just animals, trees creaking, normal woods noises. But then it started happening to us. We were there for 4 nights in September of 2013. September 24th, I think it started. We were sitting out by the fire, after dark, just talking. It was a clear night, stars out like crazy. Everything was real still. And then we heard it. Knock, knock, knock. 3 clear knocks, sounded like wood hitting wood, coming from across the river, deeper in the trees. Ron and I looked at each other. We stopped talking, just listened. Nothing else for a while. We started talking again, quiet now, trying to figure out what it could be. A branch falling? But it sounded deliberate, like someone hitting something with purpose. Then it happened again. Knock, knock. Same sound, same direction. It wasn't wind, wasn't any animal we recognized, and it definitely wasn't anyone else around, not at that hour, not that deep in the woods. We were the only ones right by the river. The next night, the 25th, that's when things got uncomfortable. We were in the camper, reading before bed. It was probably around 10 or 11 at night. Suddenly, splash! Something landed in the river. We both jumped. It sounded like a rock. We listened again, holding our breath. Then, thump! Something else hit. Closer this time, maybe closer to the camper on the riverbank. We got out of bed, went to the window, trying to peek out without being obvious. It was dark out there, pitch black except for the firelight flickering through the trees. We couldn't see anything. Then, splash, splash. 2 more rocks, hitting the river, one right after the other. It wasn't random, you could feel it. It felt like someone was throwing them, like someone was trying to get our attention, or maybe warn us off. I don't know. We stayed inside the camper the rest of the night, windows closed, curtains drawn. Every little noise made us jumpy, branches snapping, leaves rustling. We tried to tell ourselves it was just the woods, just nature being nature. But in the back of your mind, there's this little voice whispering, something's out there. Then came the 26th. The day, or really, the night, it went completely sideways. We'd had a normal day, went out panning for gold, didn't find much, but that's how it goes. Came back to camp, made dinner, sat by the fire again, trying to act normal, like the rocks and knocks the nights before were nothing. But we were both on edge. I could see it in Ron's eyes, he could see it in mine. We were listening to every single sound, strained and tense. We went to bed earlier that night, thinking maybe if we just slept through it, whatever it was would leave us alone. Famous last words, right? We were both asleep, or at least drifting in and out. It was dead quiet. No wind, no crickets, nothing. Eerily quiet. Then bam! It felt like the world exploded. This sound, this force, just slammed into the side of the camper. It was the side Ron was sleeping closest to. He yelled, shot straight up in bed. I was wide awake instantly, heart hammering in my chest. The whole camper shook. It was like a truck had driven right into us, but there was no road there, just woods. "What the hell was that?" Ron whispered, voice trembling. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I was frozen, staring into the darkness, listening, every nerve in my body screaming. We lay there, not moving, not even breathing hardly, for what felt like forever. The silence after the impact was almost worse than the impact itself. Then we started hearing it. Shuffling. Outside. Right outside the side of the camper that had been hit, like something was moving around out there. Slowly. Deliberately. Crunching on the gravel around the camper. This gravel, see, it was part of this little turnout spot where we'd parked. There was no other way in or out, except for the dirt track we'd driven in on. So whatever was out there was right next to the camper, trapped in this little area with us, and it sounded big. The crunching wasn't like a deer or a raccoon, it was heavy, deliberate, and it was bipedal. You could hear the two distinct footfalls, crunch, 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 moving around the side of the camper, then stopping, just stopping. Silence again. I remember thinking, this is it. Whatever this is, it's going to try and get in. We were trapped. Camper door on the other side, windows too small to climb through even if we could open them quietly enough. We were sitting ducks. Ron was clutching his hunting knife under the covers, knuckles white. I was just numb, completely and utterly terrified. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it, but there was no sense to be made. Animal attack? Maybe. But what animal hits a camper like that and walks upright and throws rocks? It just didn't fit. We stayed like that, frozen, listening for what felt like hours. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sounded like it was right outside the window. The shuffling sounds came and went, sometimes closer, sometimes further away, but always around the camper. It was like something was circling us, checking us out maybe, or guarding us. I don't know. My mind was a mess of fear and confusion. Eventually, the first hint of dawn started to lighten the sky. The woods started to come alive with the normal morning sounds, birds chirping, squirrels chattering, and the shuffling, it stopped. The silence outside was different now. It wasn't that heavy, oppressive silence of before. It was just normal morning quiet. Slowly, cautiously, Ron and I started to move. We got dressed, moving as quietly as we could, hearts still pounding. We had to see. We had to know what had hit us. Ron edged to the door, knife still in his hand, unlatched it slowly and peeked out. He took a deep breath, then opened the door wider. He just stood there for a second, staring. Then he stepped out. I followed him, my legs feeling like jelly. The first thing I saw was the dent on the side of the camper, right where we'd heard the impact. A massive dent, like someone had taken a sledgehammer to it, but bigger. The metal was bowed inwards, twisted. It was unbelievable, the force of it. Then Ron pointed. He didn't say anything, just pointed. And I saw it. On the side of the camper, right next to the dent, there it was. A handprint, but not a human handprint, way too big and too wide. The fingers were thick, the palm massive. It wasn't smudged, it was clear, like it had been pressed hard into the metal. Covered in mud, maybe, or dirt. Whatever it was, it contrasted against the white camper side, stark and unmistakable. It was huge, I mean seriously huge. We both just stared at it, our minds struggling to process what we were seeing. It was a handprint that was way too big to be human, and it was exactly where we'd felt that impact in the night. Exactly, like whatever it was had reached out, put its hand against the camper, and just shoved, with incredible force. We stood there in stunned silence for a long time, just looking at that handprint, taking it in, trying to understand. But there was no understanding it. There was only the cold, hard reality of what we were looking at. A handprint that didn't belong to any animal we knew, a handprint that was terrifyingly big, and a camper that had been attacked in the middle of the night by something powerful enough to leave that dent and that handprint. We didn't say much to each other after that, not right away. We were both just shell-shocked. We moved fast, though. Packed everything up as quickly as we could, didn't even bother with breakfast. Hooked the camper up to the truck and got out of there. We didn't even stop to say goodbye to the other campers up by the trail. We just wanted to be gone. Away from that river, away from those woods, away from whatever was out there. We moved the camper up to the area by the hiking trail with the other campers, parked up with them. Figured there's safety in numbers, right? We stayed there another night, just to be safe. Nothing happened, not a sound, not a knock, nothing. It was like whatever it was, it didn't want us there by the river, specifically in that spot where Jerry had been. That riverside spot was still empty when we left, wide open, like it was waiting for someone else. We never went back to that campsite by the Kokosing River, not ever. And Jerry, from what I heard, he didn't either. Something about that place, it's just wrong. Something out there, something big, something powerful, and it doesn't want people camping by that river, especially not in that spot. I don't know what it was. Sasquatch? Bigfoot? I don't know what to call it. I just know what we heard, what we felt, what we saw. That handprint, I'll never forget that handprint. And that sound, that slam against the camper. It still makes my skin crawl to think about it. It was real. Whatever it was real. And it was right there, right outside our camper, and we have no idea even now why it hit us, what it wanted. It's just out there, still out there. And that's the part that really messes with you, you know? The not knowing, the unexplained, just gone quiet. And that's it. End of story. But not really, is it? Because it's still there, in my head, waiting for the next time I close my eyes at night in the woods. Story 14. It was probably the most normal Sunday morning we'd had in ages. You know, one of those June days in Ohio where the air was just starting to get thick, but it wasn't full-on summer swampy yet. I was 11, and all I wanted was to be in those woods behind our house. 5 acres of just pure trees, perfect for a kid who wanted to disappear. My dad, he was always puttering around the yard. Mum was inside, probably getting ready for her church ladies group or something. Sundays were always her ladies' day. So, yeah, typical Sunday, but for me it was fort building day. I'd been planning this fort for weeks. Got some plywood scraps my dad was going to throw out, a hammer, some nails, all the essentials. I hiked out to my usual spot, deeper in the woods than I normally went, but there was this clearing back there that was perfect. Sunlight dappled through the leaves. It smelled like pine needles and damp earth. That good wood smell. I got to work, hammering away, feeling like I was Daniel Boone or something, lost in my own world, just me and the sounds of the forest and my hammer. Then it started. That feeling. You know, the one that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up? It wasn't a sound, not exactly. More like a shift in the air, like suddenly everything got quiet. Too quiet. The birds stopped chirping. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. I stopped hammering, stood up straight, and listened. Nothing. Just the silence, which somehow was louder than anything. I spun around slowly, looking between the trees. Sunlight was still filtering through. Everything looked normal, but that feeling just kept getting stronger. Like eyes were on me, watching me. It wasn't a friendly feeling. It was heavy, like being stared at with, I don't know, maybe not anger, but intense focus. Predatory. Yeah, that's it. Like something was hunting me, but it hadn't decided to pounce yet. My fort entrance was just a gap in the plywood I'd leaned up, facing the clearing. I crept over to it, slowly, my heart starting to thump harder in my chest. I peeked through the opening, trying to see what was making me feel so uneasy. At first, I didn't see anything. Just trees, the clearing, dappled sunlight on the forest floor. Then I saw it, standing there right in the middle of the clearing, no more than 15 feet from my fort entrance. Just standing. It was huge, like impossibly huge. I don't know how else to describe it. Tall, easily 8 feet, maybe more. Broad, too, like a brick wall standing on 2 legs, probably 4 feet wide at least. It was covered in fur, a kind of dark brown, shaggy fur. But it wasn't like any animal fur I'd ever seen, not like a dog or a bear. It was denser, almost looked manicured. Sounds crazy, I know. And its face. God, its face. It had these brown eyes, not small and beady like an animal, but big, almost human-like, deep brown and intense. And on its face there were white markings, starting between its eyes like a blaze and spreading down its face, widening as it went, then continuing down its chest in this big, distinct white patch. It looked like someone had taken a brush and painted it white on its dark fur. It was striking, beautiful almost, in a weird way. Honestly, my first thought wasn't fear. It was awe, like seeing something I wasn't supposed to see, something ancient. It was just there, standing, staring right at me, unblinking. I crawled fully out of the fort opening, just stood there staring back at it, in the middle of the clearing. We just stood there facing each other. Me, this 11-year-old kid with a hammer in my hand, and this giant thing. For what felt like forever but was probably only 10 minutes, maybe more. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. Just stood, watching. I tried to breathe normally, but my chest felt tight. My heart was pounding now, but it was more fascination than pure terror, at least at first. It didn't smell. That was weird too. You'd expect something that big, that wild-looking, to have some kind of animal smell, but there was nothing. Clean. Almost too clean. Like I said, manicured. It sounds nuts, but that's what went through my head. Like it just stepped out of some salon. Crazy, right? I was trying to figure out what it was. Bear? Nah, not a bear. Too tall, wrong face, wrong fur. Gorilla? We weren't exactly near any jungles in Ohio. Bigfoot, I'd heard stories, everyone had, but those were just stories, weren't they? The longer we stood there, the more unreal it felt. Like I was dreaming or imagining things. 10 minutes staring at something that couldn't possibly be real. I started to doubt my own eyes. Was I hallucinating? Was it the heat? Though it wasn't even that hot. My brain started trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was a guy in a costume? But who would do that? In the middle of the woods, on a Sunday morning, and the size, the way it stood, it felt organic, real, heavy. I could feel the weight of it just standing there. I guessed it had to weigh at least 400 pounds, maybe more. I needed to know. I had to get a closer look, confirm it was real. So stupidly, maybe the dumbest thing I've ever done in my life, I took a step forward, just one step. Towards it. That's when everything changed. Instantly, like a switch flipped. The creature, which had been perfectly still, started swaying. Left to right, just slightly at first, then wider and faster. It was like winding up. And then it happened. It snarled. Not a growl, not a bark, a snarl, but amplified. Deep and guttural, like something tearing inside it, but echoing out. Menacing doesn't even begin to cover it. It was primal, pure threat. The beauty, the awe, the curiosity, it all vanished, replaced instantly by raw, bone-deep, paralyzing fear. This wasn't beautiful. This wasn't interesting. This was dangerous. This was survival. My legs moved before my brain even caught up. I spun around, dropped the hammer and ran. I just ran. Blind panic. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig behind me was the sound of it chasing me. My lungs burned, my heart hammered against my ribs like it was trying to escape. Branches whipped my face. I stumbled, nearly fell, kept running. I didn't look back, couldn't look back, just ran, like my life depended on it. Because I knew, in that moment, it did. I burst out of the woods and into our backyard, gasping for breath, chest heaving, legs aching. Stumbled onto the back porch, slammed the screen door open, and practically fell into the kitchen. Dad was at the kitchen table reading the paper. Mom was probably upstairs still. "Dad! Dad!" I choked out, trying to get air back into my lungs. "There's, in the woods, a giant creature." He looked up from his paper, annoyed. "Timmy, what in the world are you yelling about?" "In the woods!" I gasped again, pointing back towards the trees. "It's huge, like a monster. It almost got me." I could barely get the words out, still terrified, still seeing those eyes, that snarl. He sighed, put down his paper. "Timmy, what have I told you about exaggerating? You've been watching too many monster movies again." "No, Dad, listen to me. It's real. I saw it. Right there in the clearing. It was huge, and it snarled at me. I barely got away." I was frantic, begging him to believe me. "We have to do something. We have to check. Please, Dad, it's dangerous." He just looked at me, that dismissive look I hated. "Timmy, there are no monsters in our woods. Probably just a deer or a bear cub you got spooked. Go play in your room and stay out of the woods for a while if you're going to imagine things like that. He went back to his paper. But Dad, Timmy, his voice was firm now, go, play in your room, now. Dejected, defeated, still shaking, I did what he said. What else could I do? I went to my room, slumped onto my bed. He didn't believe me. Of course he didn't. Monster stories. That's all he thought it was. But it wasn't a story. It was real. It was out there. Still out there. My bedroom window faced the woods, overlooked the back of our property and a sliver of the woods where my fort was. I went to the window, peered out through the leaves. Sunlight still dappled, shadows moved, leaves rustled in a light breeze that had picked up. And then I saw it. Or at least, I think I did. Deep in the shadows, barely visible through the foliage, a dark shape, brownish-black, bigger than any deer, too bulky for a person. It was still, watching, from the direction of the clearing, from where I'd seen it. I couldn't be sure. The shadows were deep, the leaves were thick, but in my gut I knew it was still there, watching me. Even from this distance, I felt those eyes. I stayed at the window for a long time, maybe an hour, staring into the woods, but the shape didn't move. Eventually, it got harder to see as the afternoon went on and shadows shifted. I lost sight of it, or maybe it moved, deeper into the woods. I didn't go back outside that day. Stayed in my room, window closed, curtains half drawn, listening to every little creak and rustle outside. Fear, real fear, had settled in, heavy and cold. A week went by. School started back up, tried to act normal, but the image of that creature, that face, that snarl, it was burned into my brain. Couldn't shake it, kept seeing it every time I closed my eyes. I avoided the woods like the plague. Dad never mentioned it again. Mom probably didn't even know. Life went back to normal on the surface. But for me, everything had changed. After a week, I needed my tools. The hammer, nails, some of the plywood was still back there at the fort. Couldn't leave it all to rot in the woods. So, the next Saturday, I forced myself. Took a deep breath, told myself it was probably gone, probably imagined it all anyway, just a deer, just shadows. Tried to convince myself it wasn't real. Armed myself with my dad's big flashlight, even though it was daytime, just for the feeling of having something. And I went back into the woods, heart pounded the whole way. Every step crunching on leaves felt like stepping on eggshells. Sunlight still dappled. The woods smelled the same, but now it felt different. Menacing. Eyes everywhere. I kept looking around. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle of leaves made me jump, made it to the clearing. Empty. Fort was still standing, plywood leaning against the trees, tools scattered around. No sign of it. Relief washed over me, weak and shaky, but relief nonetheless. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just a nightmare I'd had in broad daylight. Gathered my tools quickly, shoved them into my bag, grabbed the plywood pieces I could carry, and practically ran back out of the woods, never looked back. Vowed to myself I'd never go back there again. That was my only direct encounter, except for the very next morning. Sunday morning again. Waiting for the school bus down at the end of our street with Billy, my neighbor kid. It was still early, kinda that in-between light, not quite dark, not quite day. Twilight, I guess you'd call it. We were just standing there, kicking rocks, waiting for the bus to come rumbling down the road. I was telling him about my fort-building adventure in the woods, trying to make it sound exciting, skipping over the other part. Billy was skeptical, like all kids are. Yeah, right, Timmy. A super cool fort. Sure you built it all by yourself? He was always a little jealous of me in the woods. I shrugged. Yeah, I did. It's pretty awesome. You should see it sometime. Maybe, he said, still not convinced. Bet it's just a pile of sticks. No, it's plywood. Real fort, I insisted. Then just to sound cool, and maybe to try and get some of that fear out, I added, And there's stuff in the woods too. Weird stuff. Tried to make it sound mysterious, not terrified. He snorted. Like what? Squirrels? Rabbits? Bigfoot? He laughed. You believe in Bigfoot, Timmy? No, I said quickly. Too quickly, maybe. Just weird noises sometimes. That's all. We were staring down the road, waiting for the headlights of the bus to appear. Streetlights were still on, casting long shadows, and then it happened. The sound. Started low, a moan at first, eerie, wind-like, but deeper, louder than wind, coming from the direction of the woods behind my house, the woods where I'd seen it. The moan grew louder, deeper, rising in pitch, escalating into a scream, a piercing, unearthly scream that cut through the morning silence. It was animal, but not animal. Pain, rage, something ancient and wild poured out in that sound. It went on and on, chilling, echoing through the trees, making the hair on your arms stand straight up. Billy went pale. His eyes went wide. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in. What in the hell was that? He stammered, his voice shaky, edging closer to me, clearly terrified now. I just looked at him, my heart hammering in my chest again, not with fear this time, but with a cold kind of satisfaction. I managed a small, tight smile. See, I said, my voice barely a whisper, I told you it was true. The screaming stopped abruptly, just cut off. Silence again, thick, heavy silence. The bus headlights appeared down the road. Neither of us said another word as it pulled up. We got on, sat in silence all the way to school. Billy didn't mention it again. Neither did I. Not to him, not to anyone. Ever. To this day, I have no idea what I saw that day in the woods, or what screamed the next morning. No logical explanation for any of it. People say it's just stories, imaginations, tricks of the light, but I know what I saw, and I heard. And sometimes, late at night, when everything's quiet, I still hear that scream in my head, and I remember those eyes, staring at me, from the woods, and I know deep down that whatever it was, whatever it is, it's still out there. Story 15. Elias has this old beat-up aluminum boat, nothing fancy, but reliable. Got us out on the water just fine. We put in at the public ramp by the county line, and he starts steering us upstream, towards this part of the lake he was talking about, near the Plainfield Dam. He mentioned it had a huge log jam, an old one, and bass love to hang around those. Sounded good to me. The lake was pretty still that morning, water a bit murky, like Oakhaven usually is. You can't see too far down. Trees lining the shore, thick and green, typical Blackwood County woods. Quiet too, except for the hum of the outboard and the occasional bird call. It was peaceful, relaxing. I was just casting and reeling, not really expecting to catch anything big, more just enjoying being out there, the sun on my face. We went further and further up, the lake getting narrower, feeling more like a river channel. Elias was maneuvering the boat expertly, avoiding fallen branches and shallows. He was telling me about Oakhaven, how he'd been coming here since he was a kid, how his grandpa used to bring him. Seemed like he had a million stories about this place. I was listening, chuckling here and there, just zoning out and enjoying the ride, honestly. Then we came around a bend, and the trees seemed to close in a little more. The air felt different. Not colder exactly, but heavier, stiller. And the watercolor changed slightly, darker, more shadowed. I remember looking at the shoreline and noticing we were at some kind of junction. I could see another, smaller creek flowing into the lake from the side, a much darker, narrower creek than the main lake channel. Elias pointed towards it, mentioning something about Shadow Creek feeding into Oakhaven here. Shadow Creek. The name itself sounded a bit ominous now that I think back. It was right then, right at that confluence, where everything just shifted for me. It hit me all at once. A wave of something cold washed over me, even though the sun was blazing down. My stomach clenched tight, like I'd swallowed a stone. I stopped casting, just froze, rod in my hand, staring at the woods on the side of Shadow Creek. I didn't say anything at first, just looked. Elias was still talking, pointing towards the logjam he was aiming for, ahead and to the right, up the main channel of Oakhaven. But my eyes were fixed on the mouth of Shadow Creek, on that dark, shadowed tree line where it met the lake. And then it came back. It all just came flooding back like a dam breaking in my head. Last year. Almost exactly a year ago, actually. Same time of year. Summer heat just starting to bake everything. I was on a catfishing kick, trying to find new spots, quieter places away from the crowds down by the river. I'd been looking at maps online and found this spot marked Old County Road 27 near Shadow Creek Bridge. Seemed secluded, remote, perfect. So one night, I packed up my gear, grabbed my headlamp and drove out there after work. It was already getting dark, that thick, heavy summer darkness where the air just hangs still. Driving down Old County Road 27, it got narrower and narrower, turning into a bumpy, barely paved track. Trees pressing in close on both sides of the road. No houses around, no lights, just pure black woods as far as you could see in every direction. I parked near this old, rickety wooden bridge, the Shadow Creek Bridge. Sounded like Shadow Creek was flowing under it, but it was hard to hear over the crickets and cicadas, that wall of insect noise you get on summer nights in the woods. I grabbed my gear and headlamp, crossed the bridge, and then started following what looked like an old trail going into the woods, away from the road and down towards the creek itself. I figured I could find a good spot further downstream, maybe a bend in the creek or something where catfish might be hiding. The woods were thick, dense, even darker under the tree canopy. My headlamp cut a narrow beam through the blackness, showing me just enough to see the path in front of me. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. It was that deep, earthy smell of old woods, the kind that gets in your lungs. I walked for maybe 10 minutes, maybe 15, following the faint trail. The woods were quiet, almost eerily so. No wind, no animal sounds, just the crunch of my boots on the leaves and my own breathing. And that insect drone, always that background hum. I kept going deeper into the woods, hoping to reach the creek bank. Then I heard it, a rustling sound. Over to my left, deeper in the woods, in the pitch blackness beyond the reach of my headlamp. Just leaves rustling at first, like maybe a deer or raccoon moving through the undergrowth. I stopped, listened. Figured it was just some animal, nothing to worry about. Woods are full of animals at night. But then the rustling got louder, more deliberate somehow. Like something bigger, heavier was moving, and closer. My heart started to pick up pace. I told myself it was probably just a deer, maybe a wild hog even. Blackwood County had its share of wild hogs. But the sound, it wasn't quite right. It was too heavy, too clumsy for a deer, and too rhythmic. Like something walking, stepping through the underbrush, not just randomly rustling. The rustling got closer still, closer and louder. And then I heard branches breaking, snapping under weight. Whatever it was big, and it was moving fast, towards me. From the woods behind me, the woods I had just walked through. That's when a real knot of fear tightened in my gut. It wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was fear, primal fear, something in the way those branches were snapping, the sheer force of it, the relentless approach. It didn't sound like any animal I knew. I turned around, slowly at first, headlamp beam swinging with me, cutting through the black, hoping, praying to see just a deer, a hog, something normal. But the sounds kept coming, louder now, closer, branches cracking, leaves thrashing. It was almost on top of me. And then came the splash, a huge splash, from the direction of the creek to my right down the slope. A sound of something massive hitting the water, disturbing it in a big way. Not a small splash, not a beaver or an otter, a big, heavy splash, like something had fallen or jumped into the creek. My breath hitched in my throat. I swung my headlamp towards the sound, down towards the creek, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. And there, in the beam of my light, coming out of Shadow Creek, was it. I'll never forget it as long as I live. Never. It wasn't an animal, not like any animal I've ever seen or imagined. It was upright, tall, taller than any man. Maybe 8, 9 feet tall, I don't know, it's hard to judge in the dark like that. But huge, massive, covered in hair, dark hair, matted, thick. And the eyes, oh God, the eyes. 2 points of light burning in the darkness. Amber, glowing amber eyes fixed right on me. It was coming out of the creek, wading through the shallow water, moving towards me, slowly, deliberately, not running, not rushing, just advancing. Those eyes locked on me, unblinking, and that massive hairy form rising out of the darkness, taking shape in the beam of my headlamp. It was like something out of a nightmare, something ancient and wrong and terrifying. I was frozen, completely, utterly frozen. My mind just blanked out. All thought, all reason just shut down. Just pure, raw terror. Staring at that thing coming out of the creek. Then instinct took over, pure animal instinct, survival. I didn't think, I didn't hesitate, I just ran. I turned and ran, back the way I'd come, back towards the road, back towards the bridge, back towards my truck. I ran like I've never run in my life, adrenaline coursing through me, pumping, driving me. I didn't look back, I didn't dare, I just ran. Tripping over roots, stumbling through the undergrowth, branches whipping my face, thorns tearing at my clothes. I just kept running, blindly, desperately, back towards the light of the road, the faint, distant promise of safety. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the woods, breaking branches, still coming. Not as fast as me, maybe, but still coming, heavy, relentless. I could hear it breathing too, heavy, ragged breaths like a bull, or something bigger than a bull. I ran until my lungs burned, my legs ached, my chest felt like it was going to explode. I ran until I burst out of the woods and onto the road, stumbled onto the gravel shoulder, gasping for air, heart hammering in my ears. I could still hear crashing in the woods behind me, but fainter now, further away. I didn't stop. I kept running, stumbling towards the bridge, towards my truck parked on the other side. Got to my truck, fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so bad I could barely get them in the lock. Got the door open, scrambled inside, slammed the door shut, locked it. And then I just sat there, shaking, breathing hard, staring out into the darkness, listening, waiting. I sat there for a long time, maybe 10 minutes, maybe longer, I don't know.